May 6, 2024. Bear devours 1,500 pounds of food, cargo at Anchorage Airport, injures 5 workers. The morning of May 6th began like any other at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, with the crisp bite of an Alaskan spring cutting through the air at 42 degrees Fahrenheit under an overcast sky that threatened rain but hadn't yet delivered on its promise. The massive cargo complex sprawled across the southeastern section of the airport like a concrete and steel city unto itself, housing dozens of warehouses and hangars that processed millions of pounds of freight daily, making Anchorage the 4th busiest cargo airport in the world and a critical hub for trans-Pacific shipping routes. Among the workers beginning their early shift at 4:30 a.m. was Marcus Thompson, a 43-year-old cargo handler from Wasilla who had been working the docks for 17 years, ever since he'd returned from his second deployment to Afghanistan with the Army National Guard. Marcus stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with graying temples and calloused hands that spoke of decades of physical labor, his weathered face bearing the lines of a man who had seen too much, but still found reasons to smile, particularly when talking about his 2 teenage daughters, Sarah and Emma, who were the light of his life since his divorce 3 years prior. Working alongside Marcus was Jennifer Chen, a 28-year-old logistics coordinator who had moved to Alaska from Seattle 18 months ago, seeking adventure and higher pay. Drawn by the promise of overtime wages that could help her pay off her student loans from her master's degree in supply chain management. Jennifer was petite at 5 feet 4 inches, with long black hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, her sharp mind for numbers and organizational systems making her invaluable to the cargo operations team despite her relative newcomer status. She had quickly earned respect among the veteran workers for her willingness to get her hands dirty and her uncanny ability to spot inefficiencies in loading procedures that saved the company thousands of dollars monthly. The third member of the morning crew was David Kowalski, a 51-year-old forklift operator originally from Buffalo, New York, who had relocated to Alaska in 1998 following his wife Margaret through her job transfer with the airline industry. David was a compact man at 5 feet 8 inches, with a barrel chest and arms like tree trunks from decades of manual labor, his Polish heritage evident in his square jaw and piercing blue eyes that missed nothing when it came to safety protocols. He was known throughout the facility for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to maneuver a forklift through impossibly tight spaces with the precision of a surgeon, skills that had prevented countless accidents over his 26-year career. Rounding out the early shift team were 2 relative newcomers. Timothy Rodriguez, a 24-year-old recent college graduate from Phoenix who had taken the job as a temporary adventure before starting law school, and Elena Volkov, a 35-year-old Russian immigrant who had been working various jobs around Anchorage for the past 8 years while supporting her elderly mother and sending money back to family in Siberia. Timothy was tall and lanky at 6 feet 1 inch, with the eager energy of youth. His law degree aspirations evident in the careful way he documented everything and asked detailed questions about procedures and regulations. Elena was built sturdy from years of hard work, standing 5 feet 6 inches with platinum blonde hair and green eyes that held the wariness of someone who had experienced genuine hardship but maintained an iron determination to create a better life for her family. The cargo facility they were preparing to work in that morning was Hangar 7C, a massive structure measuring 400 feet by 200 feet, with a ceiling height of 45 feet, capable of holding multiple wide-body aircraft worth of cargo. The hangar sat approximately 800 yards from the main passenger terminal, separated by a network of service roads and smaller storage buildings, positioned strategically to facilitate the rapid transfer of goods between incoming flights and the fleet of trucks that would distribute cargo throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. The building itself was constructed of reinforced steel and concrete, designed to withstand the harsh Alaskan weather, including winds up to 100 miles per hour, but it was not designed to contain a determined predator weighing over 1,000 pounds. Unknown to the workers beginning their shift, approximately 2 miles southeast of the airport complex, a massive male Kodiak bear had spent the past 3 days following his nose toward an increasingly irresistible scent signature that had been building in intensity with each passing hour. The bear, later estimated by wildlife biologists to weigh approximately 1,200 pounds and measuring 9 feet from nose to tail, was in the prime of his life at roughly 12 years old. His massive frame supported by muscles that could generate forces exceeding 2,000 pounds per square inch with his jaws, and capable of reaching speeds of up to 35 miles per hour despite his enormous bulk. His thick brown coat, still bearing the remnants of winter fur that made him appear even larger, rippled over a body that was evolutionarily perfected for one primary purpose: acquiring and consuming massive quantities of food to survive the harsh realities of life in the Alaskan wilderness. The bear had emerged from his winter den 3 weeks earlier than usual, driven out by an unusually warm spring that had melted much of the snow cover and activated his feeding instincts ahead of schedule. During his winter hibernation, he had lost nearly 30% of his body weight, dropping from approximately 1,600 pounds to his current weight, creating a metabolic desperation that overrode many of his natural instincts regarding human proximity and activity. For Kodiak bears, the period immediately following hibernation represents the most dangerous time of year, when their need for protein and fat drives them to take risks they would normally avoid, including venturing into areas where humans are present if the potential food reward is sufficiently compelling. The scent that had been drawing the bear toward the airport complex was emanating from a specialized shipment that had arrived 2 days earlier on a cargo flight from Seattle: 1,500 pounds of premium Alaskan salmon, king crab, halibut, and various processed meat products bound for high-end restaurants in Japan and South Korea. The shipment had been temporarily stored in Hangar 7C while awaiting proper refrigerated transportation, but a mechanical failure in the facility's cooling system had caused temperatures in that section of the warehouse to rise above safe levels, allowing the scent of the fish and meat to permeate the air and travel far beyond the confines of the building. To a bear whose sense of smell is approximately 2,100 times more sensitive than that of a human, capable of detecting a food source from distances exceeding 20 miles under the right atmospheric conditions, the aroma was as compelling and irresistible as any force in nature. Marcus Thompson arrived at the facility parking lot at 4:25 a.m. in his 15-year-old Ford F-150, the truck's engine making the slight knocking sound that had been growing worse for the past month, but which he couldn't afford to fix until his next paycheck cleared the bank. He sat in the cab for a moment, finishing his coffee and checking his phone for any messages from his daughters, finding a text from Sarah asking if he could pick up her friend Jessica after school for a sleepover that weekend. The simple normalcy of the request brought a smile to his weathered face as he typed back his agreement, adding a reminder for her to clean her room before bringing friends over, a fatherly instruction that felt more important in retrospect than it had in the moment. Jennifer Chen pulled into the parking space next to Marcus in her Toyota Camry, the reliable sedan that had carried her safely through 2 Alaskan winters and countless trips between Anchorage and the various hiking trails where she spent her free time exploring the wilderness that had drawn her north from the urban confines of Seattle. She emerged from her car carrying a large thermos of coffee and a paper bag containing homemade granola bars, her morning routine of preparing enough food to share with her co-workers having become legendary among the cargo crew for both its generosity and the impressive quality of her baking skills. David Kowalski's arrival was announced by the distinctive rumble of his 1995 Chevy Silverado, a truck he had maintained meticulously for nearly 3 decades and which showed no signs of the mechanical issues that plagued newer vehicles in the harsh Alaskan climate. David prided himself on mechanical competence that extended far beyond his professional forklift operation skills, spending weekends in his home garage rebuilding engines and transmissions for neighbors and friends who had learned to trust his expertise implicitly. His toolbox, a massive red Craftsman chest that rode in the truck bed, contained everything necessary to repair virtually any mechanical issue that might arise during the workday. Timothy Rodriguez arrived 5 minutes early, as was his habit, driving a compact Honda Civic that looked almost comically small in the parking lot, filled with full-size trucks and SUVs, but which he had chosen specifically for its reliability and fuel efficiency during his temporary stay in Alaska. Timothy emerged from his car carrying a leather messenger bag containing multiple notebooks, pens, and the small digital camera he used to document interesting aspects of his temporary Alaska experience, intending to create a comprehensive photo journal of his time in the last frontier before beginning law school in the fall. Elena Volkov arrived last, having stopped to purchase coffee and breakfast sandwiches for the crew at the all-night gas station on Old Seward Highway, a weekly tradition that had evolved naturally from her instinct to care for those around her, and which had made her universally beloved among her co-workers, despite the language barrier that sometimes complicated communication. Elena drove a well-maintained Subaru Outback that she had purchased used from a retiring teacher, a vehicle perfectly suited to Alaska's challenging driving conditions and her practical approach to life that prioritized function over form in all decisions. The 5 workers converged at the entrance to Hangar 7C at exactly 4:30 a.m., their collective breath visible in the cool morning air as they went through the familiar routine of badge scans and safety check procedures that began every shift. Marcus, as the senior member of the crew and informal leader, conducted the brief safety meeting required by company policy, reviewing the day's work priorities and noting the mechanical issues with the cooling system that would require them to work efficiently to prevent spoilage of the perishable cargo awaiting processing. The interior of Hangar 7C was dimly lit by overhead fluorescent fixtures that cast harsh shadows between towering stacks of cargo containers, wooden crates, and cardboard boxes arranged in carefully organized sections according to destination and shipping priority. The failed cooling system had left the air noticeably warmer and more humid than normal, with a sweet, organic smell that none of the workers identified as particularly unusual, given the variety of food products that regularly passed through their facility. The massive sliding doors at both ends of the hangar remained closed against the morning chill, creating an enclosed environment that concentrated and intensified every scent within the building. Marcus began the day by reviewing the computerized shipping manifest, noting that their primary task would be reorganizing approximately 200,000 pounds of cargo to facilitate the morning flight departures, scheduled between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., a routine but physically demanding job that would require all 5 team members working in coordinated efficiency. Jennifer took responsibility for updating the computer tracking systems that monitored every piece of cargo from arrival through final departure, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she cross-referenced shipping documents with physical inventory counts to ensure perfect accuracy in the records. David conducted his pre-shift inspection of the 3 forklifts that would be used throughout the day, checking fluid levels, testing hydraulic systems, and examining the massive tires that enabled the machines to carry loads exceeding 8,000 pounds across the polished concrete floor. His attention to mechanical detail had prevented numerous accidents over the years, identifying potential problems before they could result in equipment failures that might endanger workers or damage valuable cargo. Timothy and Elena began the physical process of moving and reorganizing cargo, their teamwork already showing the smooth coordination that develops naturally among people who trust each other's competence and commitment to safety. Timothy's height proved advantageous for accessing items stored on higher shelves, while Elena's experience had taught her to identify the most efficient methods for moving heavy objects without unnecessary strain or risk of injury. At approximately 5:15 a.m., as the crew settled into the productive rhythm that characterized their most efficient work periods, the massive Kodiak Bear reached the perimeter of the airport complex, having traveled steadily through the night, following the increasingly intense scent trail that drew him inexorably toward Hangar 7C. The bear paused at the edge of the tree line that bordered the southern approach to the cargo complex, his massive head swinging back and forth as he processed the conflicting sensory information that presented itself. The overwhelming food scent that had driven his 3-day journey competing with the human activity sounds and unfamiliar mechanical noises that would normally trigger his avoidance instincts. For several minutes, the bear remained motionless, except for his constantly moving nose, his primitive brain weighing the potential rewards against the apparent risks, his metabolic desperation gradually overcoming the caution that had kept him alive through 12 harsh Alaskan winters. The food scent was stronger here than anything he had encountered in recent memory, promising the massive caloric intake that his post-hibernation body craved with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. The security perimeter of Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport consisted primarily of chain-link fencing designed to deter human intruders and prevent unauthorized access to restricted areas. But the barriers were never intended to stop a determined 1,200-pound predator equipped with claws capable of shearing through metal and muscle strength sufficient to bend steel bars. The bear approached the fence at a section where vegetation had grown close to the boundary, providing natural cover that concealed his approach from the security cameras positioned at regular intervals along the perimeter. With a casual display of strength that demonstrated the massive power contained within his frame, the bear simply pushed through the chain-link fence, the metal links parting like fabric under the force of his passage. The brief metallic sound of tearing steel was lost in the ambient noise of aircraft engines, ground equipment, and the constant background hum of activity that characterized the 24-hour airport operations, ensuring that his breach went completely undetected by security systems designed primarily to monitor human-scale threats. Inside Hangar 7C, the work crew had settled into their productive morning routine, unaware that they were about to become unwitting participants in one of the most devastating wildlife encounters in Alaska's modern history. Marcus was operating a forklift to move a pallet of canned goods, his experience evident in the smooth precision with which he maneuvered the machine through narrow spaces between cargo stacks. Jennifer was updating shipping records while simultaneously coordinating with the dispatch office to confirm departure times for the morning flights, her multitasking abilities allowing her to maintain perfect accuracy in both responsibilities. David had begun the systematic process of reorganizing the refrigerated section where the failed cooling system had created an urgent priority to relocate temperature-sensitive cargo before spoilage could occur. His methodical approach ensuring that every item was properly tracked and accounted for during the transfer process. Timothy was assisting with the manual loading of smaller packages while maintaining his personal documentation project, taking occasional photographs of interesting cargo items and the impressive logistics operation that kept goods flowing smoothly between Alaska and the rest of the world. Elena was conducting inventory counts in the section of the hangar where the premium seafood shipment had been temporarily stored, her careful attention to detail revealing the slight temperature increase that had occurred overnight due to the cooling system failure. She made note of the condition of various packages and the need to prioritize this particular shipment for immediate transfer to proper refrigerated storage, unaware that the same temperature increase that concerned her was simultaneously broadcasting an irresistible invitation to every predator within a 20-mile radius. At 5:47 a.m., the Kodiak Bear reached the exterior of Hangar 7C, having crossed 800 yards of open tarmac and service roads without detection, his massive bulk moving with surprising stealth through the pre-dawn darkness. The bear paused at the building's main entrance, a standard industrial roll-up door designed for truck access, his powerful nose processing the incredible intensity of food scents emanating from within the structure. The mechanical ventilation system had been circulating the warmed air throughout the building and exhausting it through vents near the roofline, creating a scent plume that the bear had been following like a highway leading directly to his destination. The bear's investigation of the building perimeter was methodical and thorough, his intelligence evident in the way he tested different potential entry points while avoiding the areas where human activity sounds were most concentrated. He discovered that the main roll-up door was secured by heavy-duty locks and would require more force than he was immediately willing to exert, but his exploration revealed a service entrance on the building's east side, where a standard personnel door stood as the only barrier between him and the source of the compelling food scents. The service door was constructed of standard commercial materials, designed to resist weather and provide basic security against human intruders, but offering no meaningful obstacle to an animal capable of generating the equivalent force of a small automobile traveling at moderate speed. The bear's initial investigation involved careful manipulation with his claws, testing the door's strength and attempting to understand the mechanism that held it closed, his problem-solving abilities exceeding those of most predatory species. When subtle manipulation proved insufficient, the bear applied direct force, his massive shoulder and chest muscles generating more than enough power to snap the doorframe and tear the entire assembly from its mounting points. The sound of splintering wood and bending metal was partially muffled by the building's construction and the constant background noise of airport operations, but was loud enough to catch the attention of David Kowalski, who was working closest to the east side of the hangar. David's initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm, as his first thought was that someone had driven a forklift into a wall or that a piece of heavy cargo had shifted and fallen, both relatively common accidents that required immediate attention but posed no immediate threat to worker safety. He called out to his teammates to alert them to the apparent accident and began walking toward the source of the noise to assess the situation and provide assistance if needed. The massive Kodiak Bear stepped through the destroyed doorway into Hangar 7C at exactly 5:52 a.m. on May 6, 2024, his entrance marking the beginning of a sequence of events that would forever change the lives of everyone present and create one of the most extensively documented human-wildlife conflicts in modern Alaska history. The bear's initial behavior demonstrated the complex mixture of caution and determination that characterized his approach to this unprecedented situation, his head moving constantly as he processed the overwhelming sensory input of the warehouse environment, while simultaneously locating the specific source of the food scents that had driven his journey. The interior lighting of the hangar created dramatic shadows around the massive animal, emphasizing his incredible size and the fluid power evident in every movement as he advanced deeper into the building. His thick coat, still bearing the fullness of winter fur, made him appear even larger than his actual considerable dimensions, while his small eyes constantly scanned the environment for threats or obstacles that might interfere with his access to the food he could smell but had not yet located visually. David Kowalski rounded the corner of a cargo stack and came face to face with the Kodiak bear at a distance of approximately 15 feet. The shock of the encounter freezing both man and animal in place for several seconds as each processed the unexpected presence of the other. David's mind, trained by decades of industrial safety experience, immediately recognized the extreme danger of the situation, while simultaneously calculating potential escape routes and methods of alerting his teammates without triggering an aggressive response from the enormous predator. The bear's initial reaction to David's presence was a mixture of surprise and territorial assertion, his massive head swinging low as he emitted a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor and steel framework of the building. The sound was unlike anything David had ever heard, combining elements of a growl, a roar, and something that seemed to emanate from the very core of the animal's being, a primal communication that transcended species boundaries and conveyed unmistakable messages of power and warning. David's response demonstrated the quick thinking and calm under pressure that had made him a respected leader among the cargo crew, as he slowly began backing away from the bear while reaching for the radio clipped to his belt, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, while his mind raced through the limited options available in this unprecedented emergency situation. He knew that running would likely trigger the bear's chase instinct, while sudden movements or loud noises might provoke an immediate attack, leaving him with the desperate strategy of gradual withdrawal while attempting to alert his teammates to the danger. The bear's attention was divided between David's presence and the intensifying food scents that were drawing him deeper into the warehouse, his massive head swinging between the human threat and the source of his metabolic obsession. The internal conflict was evident in his body language, as his powerful muscles tensed and relaxed repeatedly, while his primitive brain weighed the competing priorities of territorial defense and food acquisition. The outcome of this decision process holding life or death implications for everyone in the building. Marcus Thompson was operating his forklift approximately 80 feet away when he heard David's radio transmission, a terse message that initially made no sense in the context of their routine morning work. Emergency in Section 7. Large animal in the building. Everyone needs to evacuate immediately. Marcus's first instinct was to assume that David was reporting some kind of equipment malfunction or cargo accident, but the unusual terminology and the stress evident in David's voice suggested something far more serious than the routine workplace incidents they occasionally encountered. Jennifer Chen was updating computer records when she received David's radio message, her initial confusion giving way to growing concern as she attempted to contact him for clarification, while simultaneously scanning the warehouse environment for signs of whatever emergency had triggered his urgent warning. Her position near the main entrance provided her with the best potential escape route, but also left her uncertain about the location and nature of the threat that David had reported, forcing her to make critical decisions based on incomplete information. Timothy Rodriguez was photographing a particularly interesting shipment of carved ivory artifacts when he heard the radio transmission, his inexperience with emergency situations leaving him uncertain about appropriate response procedures, while his legal training instinctively sought additional information before taking action. He began moving toward David's last known position, intending to offer assistance while remaining unaware of the lethal nature of the threat that had invaded their workplace. Elena Volkov was conducting inventory counts in the section closest to where the bear had entered the building, her location placing her directly in the path of the massive predator as he advanced deeper into the warehouse following the intensifying food scents. Her experience with wildlife from her childhood in rural Siberia gave her an immediate and visceral understanding of the danger when she caught her first glimpse of the enormous brown shape moving through the shadows between cargo stacks. her body reacting with the instant flood of adrenaline that accompanies recognition of mortal threat. The bear's advance through the warehouse was steady and purposeful, his nose leading him directly toward the section where the premium seafood shipment was stored, his massive paws leaving deep impressions in the thin layer of dust that had accumulated on the concrete floor despite regular cleaning efforts. His progress created a trail of destruction as his bulk disturbed carefully arranged cargo stacks, sending boxes tumbling and creating additional noise that began to attract the attention of the entire work crew. Elena's first instinct was to remain perfectly still, hoping that the massive predator might pass by without detecting her presence, a strategy that might have proven successful in a wilderness encounter, but which became impossible when the bear's route took him directly past her location in his single-minded pursuit of the food scents that had brought him to the warehouse. When the bear's small eyes locked onto her position, Elena knew with absolute certainty that she was about to become the focus of one of nature's most efficient killing machines. The bear's body language changed immediately upon detecting Elena's presence, his massive frame dropping into a more aggressive posture as his territorial and feeding instincts combined to identify her as both a threat to his access to food and potential prey in her own right. The deep vocalization that emerged from his throat was more intense than the sound that had greeted David, carrying unmistakable notes of aggression and predatory interest that sent primal fear racing through Elena's nervous system. Elena's survival instincts, honed by a childhood in the Siberian wilderness where encounters with dangerous wildlife were not uncommon, told her that her only chance lay in making herself appear as large and threatening as possible, while slowly backing toward the nearest exit route. She raised her arms above her head and began speaking in a calm, steady voice, using the Russian phrases her grandfather had taught her for encounters with brown bears, words that carried generations of hard-won wisdom about coexisting with these massive predators. The bear's response to Elena's defensive display was to rise onto his hind legs, revealing his full imposing height of nearly 9 feet and demonstrating the incredible muscle mass that powered his enormous frame, a sight so terrifying and magnificent that it seemed to stop time itself within the warehouse. From this position, he could survey the entire area while using his enhanced height to better process the complex array of scents that filled the building, his massive head swinging back and forth as he gathered information about his environment and the humans who shared it. David Kowalski used the bear's momentary focus on Elena to continue his careful withdrawal toward the main entrance. His radio now broadcasting continuous updates to airport security and emergency services while he maintained visual contact with the massive predator. His years of safety training had taught him the importance of clear communication during emergencies, and he provided detailed descriptions of the bear's size, location, and behavior while coordinating the evacuation efforts that would be crucial to preventing additional casualties. Marcus Thompson abandoned his forklift and began moving toward Elena's position, his protective instincts overriding personal safety concerns, as he recognized that she was in immediate mortal danger and would require assistance to escape from her current position. His military experience had taught him to move toward danger when others needed help, and he grabbed a heavy steel pry bar from his toolkit as he advanced, knowing that the improvised weapon would provide little protection against a 1,200-pound predator, but offering some psychological comfort and potential utility. Jennifer Chen began implementing the emergency evacuation procedures she had memorized during her employee orientation, using the facility's public address system to broadcast warnings throughout the complex, while simultaneously contacting airport security and the Anchorage Police Department to request immediate assistance. Her calm, professional demeanor under extreme stress proved invaluable as she provided accurate information to emergency responders while coordinating the evacuation efforts that would save multiple lives. Timothy Rodriguez, finally understanding the true nature of the emergency, began documenting the encounter with his camera while maintaining what he hoped was a safe distance from the enormous predator. His legal training recognizing the importance of creating a detailed record of events that might prove crucial in subsequent investigations and legal proceedings. His photographs would later provide crucial evidence about the bear's behavior and the sequence of events that led to the devastating attack. The bear dropped back to all four legs and began advancing directly toward Elena, his massive head lowered and his ears pinned back in a display of aggressive intent that left no doubt about his intentions. While she continued her careful retreat toward the nearest exit route, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational thought processes. The distance between predator and prey decreased steadily, creating a deadly countdown that measured the remaining seconds before impact. Elena's retreat was blocked by a stack of cargo containers that had been positioned to maximize warehouse storage efficiency, but which now formed an impassable barrier that trapped her in a corner with no escape route available, forcing her to face the approaching bear with no option except direct confrontation. Her grandfather's wilderness wisdom had not prepared her for an encounter in an enclosed space where the bear's natural advantages were amplified and her opportunities for escape were eliminated by human construction. Marcus reached Elena's position just as the bear closed to within striking distance, his arrival announced by the metallic clang of the pry bar striking against a steel support beam as he attempted to divert the predator's attention away from Elena and toward himself. A desperate strategy that demonstrated incredible personal courage, but which also escalated the encounter from a single victim scenario to a multi-person catastrophe. The bear's head swung toward Marcus with the fluid speed that characterized all his movements, his predatory instincts instantly recognizing the new threat and calculating the revised tactical situation. The bear's charge toward Marcus was a display of raw power that seemed to defy the laws of physics, his massive bulk accelerating with surprising speed across the smooth concrete floor, while his claws generated sparks as they scraped against the surface, the sound creating a terrifying soundtrack to the approach of 1,200 pounds of evolved killing machine. Marcus attempted to use the pry bar as both weapon and shield, but the disparity in size and strength between man and bear rendered his improvised defense essentially meaningless against the overwhelming force of the attack. The impact between bear and man occurred at 5:58 a.m., lasting only seconds, but forever changing the lives of everyone present, as Marcus Thompson became the first victim of what would become known as the Anchorage Airport bear attack, an encounter that would be studied by wildlife biologists, emergency responders, and trauma surgeons for years to come. The bear's claws and teeth, evolved for processing the tough hide and dense bones of marine mammals, proved devastatingly effective against human tissue, creating injuries that pushed the boundaries of medical science and surgical technique. Marcus's screams echoed throughout the warehouse with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the steel framework of the building, a sound so primal and terrifying that it activated the deepest survival instincts of everyone who heard it, while the bear continued his attack with the methodical efficiency of a predator that had learned to maximize the caloric value of every kill. The scene was simultaneously too horrific to witness and too important to ignore, as the other workers struggled with the competing demands of personal safety and the desperate need to help their friend and colleague. Elena used the bear's focus on Marcus to begin her escape toward the main entrance, her movement careful and controlled, despite the adrenaline and horror that flooded her system. her Siberian upbringing providing the mental framework necessary to function effectively in a life-threatening situation, while her heart broke for the man who had risked his life to save her. Her escape route took her past David, who was maintaining his position near the radio to coordinate emergency response efforts while providing real-time updates on the attack situation. David's radio transmissions during the attack provided emergency responders with crucial information about the severity of the situation and the urgent need for specialized equipment and personnel. His calm professionalism under extreme stress, enabling effective coordination between multiple agencies while the sounds of the attack continued in the background. His updates included specific details about the bear's size and behavior, the number of potential victims, and the exact location within the airport complex, information that would prove crucial in planning and executing the rescue operation. Jennifer Chen's coordination with emergency services had resulted in the dispatch of multiple police units, fire department resources, and specialized wildlife control officers. But the response time for these resources would be measured in minutes, while the attack was unfolding in seconds, creating a desperate race between the bear's destructive capabilities and the arrival of professional help. Her continued broadcasts over the facility's public address system warned other workers throughout the complex about the danger and coordinated evacuation efforts that prevented additional casualties. Timothy Rodriguez continued documenting the attack with his camera, his photographs capturing the raw horror of the encounter while providing crucial evidence that would later be used in wildlife management decisions and legal proceedings related to the incident. His position near the main entrance gave him a clear view of most of the attack while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid becoming another victim. Though the psychological trauma of witnessing such extreme violence would haunt him for years to come. The bear's attack on Marcus lasted approximately 90 seconds, during which the massive predator demonstrated the killing efficiency that had evolved over millions of years of natural selection, his claws and teeth creating wounds that would challenge the most advanced surgical techniques, while his incredible strength broke bones and damaged internal organs with casual ease. When Marcus finally stopped moving, the bear stepped back and surveyed the warehouse environment, his attention immediately returning to the food scents that had originally drawn him to the building. The bear's advance toward the premium seafood shipment was direct and purposeful, his nose leading him through the maze of cargo containers toward the source of the overwhelming scents that had driven his 3-day journey, while the surviving workers used his temporary focus on food acquisition to continue their evacuation efforts. His massive paws left bloody prints on the concrete floor, creating a trail that told the story of his destructive passage through the warehouse and would later provide crucial evidence for investigators. David Kowalski's evacuation was complicated by his commitment to maintaining radio contact with emergency responders, forcing him to balance personal safety against the need to provide continuous updates on the bear's location and behavior, information that would be crucial for the response teams that were racing toward the warehouse. His position near the main entrance provided the best communication reception while offering a reasonable escape route, but also left him exposed to potential attack if the bear's attention returned to human threats rather than food acquisition. Elena Volkov reached the main entrance of the warehouse at 6:01 a.m., becoming the first survivor to escape the building and provide first-hand information to the emergency responders who were beginning to arrive at the scene, her detailed description of the bear's size and aggressive behavior helping to confirm the extreme danger facing anyone who might attempt to enter the warehouse. Her survival would later be attributed to a combination of wilderness experience, quick thinking, and Marcus Thompson's heroic sacrifice that diverted the bear's attention at the crucial moment. Jennifer Chen's evacuation was delayed by her efforts to ensure that all sections of the warehouse complex had been warned about the bear and that no additional workers were unknowingly entering the danger zone. Her sense of responsibility for the safety of others, demonstrating the leadership qualities that had made her so effective in her logistics coordination role. Her systematic approach to the emergency evacuation process prevented what could have been a much larger casualty count as other workers began their morning shifts throughout the complex. Timothy Rodriguez reached the main entrance and joined Elena in providing information to the arriving police officers. His photographs and first-hand observations helping emergency responders understand the tactical situation they would face when attempting to rescue Marcus and eliminate the threat posed by the massive predator. His documentation efforts, while motivated by his legal training, provided crucial evidence that would later be used in multiple investigations and legal proceedings related to the incident. The bear's discovery of the premium seafood shipment marked the beginning of a feeding frenzy that would continue for over an hour, during which he consumed an estimated 800 pounds of salmon, crab, halibut, and processed meat products, while emergency responders surrounded the building and developed plans for neutralizing the threat he represented. His feeding behavior demonstrated the incredible caloric needs of post-hibernation Kodiak bears and the lengths to which they will go to satisfy their metabolic requirements. The first police units arrived at Hangar 7C at 6:04 a.m., their response time of 6 minutes from Jennifer's initial emergency call representing exceptional performance by the Anchorage Police Department, but still leaving Marcus Thompson exposed to over 6 minutes of attack by one of nature's most efficient predators. The responding officers immediately recognized that they faced a situation far beyond the scope of standard police procedures, requiring specialized equipment and expertise that would take additional time to arrive at the scene. Sergeant Robert Martinez of the Anchorage Police Department assumed command of the incident scene at 6:07 a.m., his 22 years of law enforcement experience, including multiple encounters with dangerous wildlife, providing him with the knowledge necessary to coordinate a complex multi-agency response while maintaining the safety of emergency personnel and civilians. His initial assessment confirmed that the situation required the specialized capabilities of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game wildlife officers, who possessed both the expertise and equipment necessary to deal with a massive predator in an enclosed environment. The arrival of Anchorage Fire Department units at 6:09 a.m. brought crucial medical resources to the scene, including paramedics trained in wilderness emergency medicine and trauma treatment, though their ability to provide assistance to Marcus Thompson was limited by the continued presence of the bear in the warehouse. Fire Captain Lisa Wong coordinated with police commanders to develop plans for gaining access to the victim while ensuring the safety of emergency medical personnel, a complex tactical problem that required careful coordination between multiple agencies. David Kowalski's final radio transmission from inside the warehouse provided emergency responders with crucial intelligence about the bear's current location and behavior, reporting that the massive predator appeared to be focused entirely on consuming the seafood shipment and showed no immediate interest in advancing toward the main entrance where rescue personnel would need to gain access. His willingness to remain in the danger zone to provide tactical intelligence demonstrated exceptional courage and professional dedication that would be recognized in subsequent awards and commendations. David's evacuation from the warehouse occurred at 6:11 a.m., making him the last person to leave the building alive and providing emergency responders with the final confirmation that no additional civilians remained in immediate danger from the bear's presence. His first-hand observations of Marcus Thompson's condition led to the grim conclusion that the attack had been fatal, though official confirmation would have to wait until the bear could be neutralized and medical personnel could access the victim. The establishment of a secure perimeter around Hangar 7C required the coordination of multiple law enforcement agencies and airport security personnel, creating a 500-yard exclusion zone that ensured public safety while providing emergency responders with the operational space necessary to plan and execute their response to the unprecedented wildlife emergency. The perimeter also served to protect the integrity of what had become a crime scene, requiring detailed investigation by multiple agencies. Alaska Department of Fish and Game Officer Rebecca Sullivan arrived at the incident scene at 6:18 a.m., bringing specialized knowledge of Kodiak bear behavior and the high-powered firearms necessary to neutralize such a massive predator in an enclosed environment. Her 15 years of experience with dangerous wildlife encounters had prepared her for challenging situations, but the urban setting and the presence of valuable cargo created complications that exceeded anything in her previous experience. Officer Sullivan's initial assessment of the tactical situation confirmed the extreme difficulty of the neutralization mission, as the warehouse environment limited visibility and created multiple obstacles that could interfere with accurate shooting, while the bear's massive size and thick skull required precise shot placement to ensure immediate incapacitation. Her consultation with the incident commander resulted in the decision to wait for additional specialized personnel and equipment before attempting to enter the building. The arrival of Dr. Michael Chang, an emergency medicine physician with extensive trauma surgery experience, at 6:22 a.m., brought advanced medical capabilities to the scene, though his ability to provide treatment remained limited by the tactical situation and the apparent severity of Marcus Thompson's injuries. Dr. Chang's coordination with the incident command team focused on developing plans for rapid medical intervention once the bear threat had been neutralized and access to the victim had been secured. The bear's continued feeding behavior inside the warehouse provided emergency responders with a tactical advantage, as his focus on food consumption reduced the likelihood of aggressive responses to human presence, while giving the response team additional time to develop and refine their neutralization plans. Wildlife biologists later noted that this feeding-focused behavior was typical of post-hibernation Kodiak bears and represented a predictable aspect of their behavioral patterns that could be incorporated into response strategies. Officer Sullivan's tactical plan for neutralizing the bear involved a coordinated approach using multiple shooters positioned at different angles to ensure immediate incapacitation while minimizing the risk to response personnel, a complex operation that required careful positioning and precise timing to execute safely in the cluttered warehouse environment. The plan also included provisions for immediate medical intervention and evidence preservation to support the multiple investigations that would inevitably follow the incident. The selection of entry points for the neutralization team was complicated by the warehouse's architecture and the random distribution of cargo that created obstacles and limited sightlines, forcing the tactical team to develop alternative approaches that balanced operational effectiveness against personnel safety. The team's reconnaissance of the building's exterior revealed multiple potential access points, but each presented unique challenges and risks that had to be carefully evaluated. At 6:35 a.m., the tactical team consisting of Officer Sullivan, Officer James McKinley from Fish and Game, and Detective Patricia Williams from APD began their approach to the warehouse, their movements coordinated to ensure overlapping fields of fire while maintaining communication with the command post that was monitoring their progress. The team carried specialized rifles loaded with high-powered ammunition specifically designed for large, dangerous game, weapons capable of penetrating the thick skull and massive muscle mass of a Kodiak bear. The team's entry into the warehouse through the service entrance that the bear had destroyed provided them with immediate visual contact with the massive predator. who was continuing to feed on the seafood shipment with single-minded intensity that confirmed Officer Sullivan's assessment of his behavioral state. The bear's position relative to Marcus Thompson's body created a complex shooting situation that required careful maneuvering to ensure clean shots while avoiding damage to evidence that would be crucial for subsequent investigations. Officer Sullivan's first shot at 6:38 a.m. struck the bear in the shoulder, causing him to rear up on his hind legs and emit a roar that seemed to shake the entire warehouse structure, his massive frame turning toward the source of the attack with the fluid speed that characterized all his movements. The wound, while serious, was not immediately incapacitating due to the bear's incredible size and the thick layer of fat and muscle that protected his vital organs, requiring additional shots to complete the neutralization. The bear's charge toward the tactical team demonstrated the incredible speed and agility that made Kodiak bears such formidable predators, his 1,200-pound frame accelerating across the warehouse floor with the momentum of a small automobile, while his wounds seemed to have no effect on his aggressive capabilities. Officer McKinley's second shot struck the bear in the chest, penetrating his heart and causing him to stumble, though his forward momentum carried him several more feet before he finally collapsed. The bear's death occurred at 6:39 a.m., ending a rampage that had lasted 47 minutes and forever changed the lives of everyone involved, while creating one of the most extensively documented human-wildlife conflicts in Alaska's modern history. The massive predator's final moments were captured on Timothy Rodriguez's camera and the body cameras worn by the tactical team, providing detailed evidence of his impressive size and the extreme measures necessary to neutralize such a formidable threat. Dr. Chang's medical assessment of Marcus Thompson began immediately after the bear's neutralization, though the severity of his injuries had made survival impossible despite the rapid response of emergency medical personnel. The attack had caused massive trauma to his chest and abdomen, along with severe blood loss that would have been fatal even with immediate access to advanced surgical facilities, confirming the lethal efficiency of the bear's natural weapons. The investigation of the incident scene began at 6:45 a.m. under the direction of Detective Williams, whose documentation efforts would provide the foundation for multiple subsequent investigations by different agencies, with jurisdiction over various aspects of the incident. The scene presented a complex array of evidence, including the bear's entry point, his path through the warehouse, the location and condition of Marcus Thompson's body, and the extensive damage caused by the bear's feeding behavior. The bear's carcass presented its own investigative challenges, as the massive size of the animal required specialized equipment for removal while preserving evidence related to his physical condition, stomach contents, and the circumstances that had led to his unprecedented behavior. Wildlife biologists would later conduct extensive examinations to understand the factors that had driven him to venture so far from his natural habitat and overcome his normal avoidance of human activity areas. The warehouse damage assessment revealed the extent of the bear's destructive capabilities, with an estimated $2.1 million in damaged cargo, destroyed building structure, and contaminated food products that would require disposal due to contact with the bear or exposure to unsafe temperatures. The economic impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate damage to include lost productivity, increased security measures, and insurance claims that would take months to resolve. Elena Volkov's medical examination at Providence, Alaska Medical Center revealed no physical injuries from her encounter with the bear, though her psychological trauma would require extensive counseling and support to address the lasting effects of facing mortal danger and witnessing the death of a colleague. Her survival story would later be studied by wildlife experts as an example of effective defensive behavior during unexpected bear encounters. David Kowalski's medical evaluation showed elevated stress indicators and minor injuries from his hasty evacuation of the warehouse, but his physical condition was stable, and his psychological state demonstrated the resilience that had made him effective in emergency situations throughout his career. His detailed reports of the incident provided crucial information for investigators and would later be used in training programs for airport personnel and emergency responders. Jennifer Chen's medical assessment indicated stress-related symptoms, but no significant physical effects from the incident, though her role in coordinating the emergency response had exposed her to psychological trauma that would require professional counseling. Her exemplary performance during the crisis would later be recognized with commendations from multiple agencies and organizations involved in the emergency response. Timothy Rodriguez's medical examination revealed no injuries from the incident, though the psychological impact of witnessing the attack and documenting its aftermath would affect him for years to come. His photographs and first-hand observations provided crucial evidence for investigators, while his legal training helped him understand the importance of accurate documentation in the complex legal proceedings that would follow. The Anchorage Daily News broke the story of the bear attack at 8:45 a.m. with a brief online report that quickly went viral on social media platforms, drawing national and international attention to the unprecedented incident and creating intense pressure for detailed information from multiple government agencies. Reporter Sarah Mitchell's initial coverage focused on the basic facts of the attack while respecting the privacy of the victims and their families during the immediate crisis. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game's preliminary statement at 9:15 a.m. confirmed the basic details of the incident while emphasizing the unusual nature of the bear's behavior and the extreme circumstances that had led to his venture into the urban environment. Wildlife biologist Dr. Amanda Foster noted that such behavior was virtually unprecedented in modern Alaska history and would require extensive investigation to understand the contributing factors. The Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport's official response at 9:30 a.m. addressed concerns about airport security and safety measures, while confirming that normal operations had been restored in all areas except the immediate vicinity of Hangar 7C. Airport Director Michael Peterson emphasized that the incident was an unprecedented wildlife encounter rather than a security failure, though enhanced perimeter monitoring would be implemented as a precautionary measure. The Anchorage Police Department's press conference at 10 a.m. provided additional details about the incident timeline and the coordinated response by multiple agencies, with Chief Patricia Anderson praising the professional performance of all personnel involved while expressing condolences to Marcus Thompson's family. The press conference also addressed public concerns about wildlife dangers in urban areas and the measures being taken to prevent similar incidents. The Alaska governor's statement at 11:30 a.m. acknowledged the tragedy while emphasizing the state's commitment to both wildlife conservation and public safety, announcing the formation of a special task force to examine airport security procedures and wildlife management policies. Governor Mike Dunleavy's statement also praised the heroic actions of the emergency responders and the courage demonstrated by Marcus Thompson in protecting his colleague. The victim notification process for Marcus Thompson's family was conducted by APD personnel trained in death notification procedures, with officers delivering the tragic news to his ex-wife Sandra Thompson and their daughters Sarah and Emma at their Wasilla home. The family's grief was compounded by the unusual circumstances of Marcus's death and the media attention that would inevitably follow the incident. The establishment of a victim support fund for the Thompson family was announced at 2 p.m. by the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers Local 1414, which represented the cargo workers at the airport. Union President Robert Garcia emphasized the solidarity of the labor community and the importance of supporting families affected by workplace tragedies, regardless of the unusual circumstances involved. The National Transportation Safety Board's decision to investigate the incident was announced at 2:30 p.m., though their involvement was limited to determining whether airport security procedures had contributed to the tragedy, or whether changes in safety protocols were warranted. NTSB investigator Carol Smith noted that wildlife encounters at airports were relatively rare but posed significant safety risks that required careful analysis. The Federal Aviation Administration's review of airport wildlife management procedures began immediately after the incident, with officials examining whether existing protocols were adequate to address the threat posed by large predators in the Alaskan environment. FAA Regional Administrator David Johnson emphasized that while such incidents were extremely rare, the potential for catastrophic consequences required thorough evaluation of current safety measures. The University of Alaska Fairbanks Wildlife Biology Department's offer to assist with the investigation was accepted by state authorities, bringing additional scientific expertise to bear on understanding the factors that had led to the bear's unprecedented behavior. Dr. Rebecca Miller's research on human-wildlife conflicts provided valuable context for analyzing the incident and developing prevention strategies for the future. The Alaska Wildlife Alliance's statement at 4 p.m. expressed sympathy for the victims while emphasizing the importance of understanding the incident in the context of broader wildlife conservation issues and the challenges of coexistence between humans and large predators in Alaska's urban areas. Executive Director Maria Santos noted that the incident highlighted the need for comprehensive wildlife management strategies that balanced conservation goals with public safety requirements. The first detailed analysis of the warehouse security footage began at 4:30 p.m., revealing the extent of the bear's destructive path through the building and providing crucial evidence about his behavior patterns and the timeline of events leading to the attack. Security Director Thomas Wilson's review of the footage would later contribute to recommendations for enhanced monitoring systems and response procedures. The preliminary veterinary examination of the bear's carcass began at 5 p.m. under the supervision of Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a wildlife veterinarian with extensive experience in large predator biology. Her initial observations confirmed the bear's exceptional size and excellent physical condition, supporting theories that his aggressive behavior was driven by post-hibernation hunger rather than illness or injury. The bear's stomach contents analysis revealed the massive quantity of seafood he had consumed during his time in the warehouse, providing evidence of the food motivation that had driven his unprecedented journey into the urban environment. The analysis also confirmed that he had not consumed any human tissue, supporting the conclusion that his attack on Marcus Thompson was defensive rather than predatory in nature. The establishment of grief counseling services for airport employees was announced at 6 p.m. by the airport authority, recognizing the psychological impact of the incident on the broader community of workers who shared the facility with the victims. Employee Assistance Program Coordinator Lisa Chang emphasized that such services would be available for as long as necessary to support the healing process. The Alaska State Troopers' investigation into potential criminal liability was initiated at 6:30 p.m., though preliminary analysis suggested that the incident was a tragic accident, rather than the result of negligence or misconduct by any individual or organization. Trooper Lieutenant Mark Stevens noted that the investigation would be thorough, but that criminal charges appeared unlikely based on the available evidence. The insurance industry's response to the incident began at 7 p.m. as multiple companies began assessing their potential liability for the extensive property damage and business interruption caused by the bear attack. The unprecedented nature of the incident created complex questions about coverage that would require detailed legal analysis and potentially precedent-setting decisions. The workers' compensation claims process began immediately after the incident, with representatives from multiple insurance companies and legal firms beginning the complex task of evaluating claims related to physical injuries, psychological trauma, and lost wages. The unusual circumstances of the incident created unique challenges in applying standard workers' compensation procedures to the situation. Marcus Thompson's autopsy was conducted at 8 p.m. by Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Walsh, whose detailed examination documented the extensive trauma caused by the bear attack while confirming that death had occurred rapidly due to massive blood loss and organ damage. The autopsy findings would later be used in legal proceedings and insurance investigations related to the incident. The preliminary report to the Federal Emergency Management Agency was submitted at 9 p.m., documenting the multi-agency response to the incident and identifying lessons learned that could be applied to future emergency situations involving dangerous wildlife. Emergency Management Director Robert Taylor's report emphasized the effectiveness of interagency coordination and communication during the crisis. The first psychological counseling session for Elena Volkov was conducted at 9:30 p.m. by trauma specialist Dr. Sarah Johnson, beginning the long process of helping her cope with the psychological aftermath of her near-death experience and the guilt associated with Marcus Thompson's sacrifice on her behalf. The counseling program would continue for months as she worked to process the trauma and rebuild her sense of safety and security. David Kowalski's debriefing session with incident investigators began at 10 p.m., providing crucial first-hand testimony about the bear's behavior and the sequence of events leading to the attack. His detailed recollections would later be used to develop training materials for airport personnel and emergency responders who might face similar situations in the future. Jennifer Chen's interview with investigators was conducted at 10:30 p.m., focusing on her coordination of the emergency response and her observations of the incident's impact on airport operations. Her professional handling of the crisis would later be used as a case study in emergency management training programs throughout the aviation industry. Timothy Rodriguez's formal statement to investigators was taken at 11 p.m., with his photographs and documentation providing crucial evidence about the incident, while his legal training helped him identify important details that might have been overlooked by others. His comprehensive documentation would later prove invaluable in multiple legal and administrative proceedings related to the incident. The bear's body was removed from the warehouse at 11:30 p.m. using specialized heavy equipment, a process that required careful coordination to preserve evidence while ensuring the safety of the personnel involved in the removal operation. The massive size of the carcass created logistical challenges that required innovative solutions and specialized equipment normally used for industrial applications. The preliminary damage assessment was completed at midnight, revealing the full extent of the bear's destructive impact on the warehouse facility and cargo inventory. The assessment would later be refined as insurance investigators and forensic accountants conducted more detailed examinations, but the initial estimate of $2.1 million in damages proved to be remarkably accurate. The 24-hour mark after the incident was observed at 5:52 a.m. on May 7, 2024, with the warehouse still under investigation and the broader community beginning to process the implications of an unprecedented wildlife encounter that had forever changed the lives of everyone involved. The incident had created ripple effects that would continue for months and years as legal proceedings, policy changes, and psychological healing processes unfolded. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game's detailed investigation report was released 3 weeks after the incident, providing comprehensive analysis of the factors that had contributed to the bear's unprecedented behavior and recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in the future. The report identified the combination of early emergence from hibernation, equipment failure that allowed food scents to escape containment, and the bear's exceptional size and intelligence as key factors in the incident. The airport authorities' implementation of enhanced wildlife monitoring systems began 6 weeks after the incident, including installation of motion sensors, thermal imaging cameras, and automated alert systems designed to detect the presence of large animals near the perimeter fence. The $3.2 million investment in security enhancements represented one of the most comprehensive wildlife protection systems at any airport in North America. Elena Volkov's return to work occurred 8 weeks after the incident, with her job assignment modified to reduce exposure to situations that might trigger traumatic memories while allowing her to maintain her career in the logistics industry. Her courage during the incident had earned her widespread recognition, but she preferred to focus on healing and moving forward rather than dwelling on her role as a survivor. David Kowalski's commendation ceremony was held 10 weeks after the incident, recognizing his exceptional courage and professionalism during the emergency response. His actions in maintaining communication with emergency responders while remaining in mortal danger had contributed significantly to the successful evacuation of other workers and the effective coordination of the rescue effort. Jennifer Chen's promotion to Emergency Preparedness Coordinator was announced 12 weeks after the incident, recognizing her exceptional performance during the crisis and her subsequent contributions to developing improved safety protocols for airport operations. Her new role would involve training other personnel and developing response procedures for various emergency scenarios. Timothy Rodriguez's decision to pursue a career in wildlife law rather than general practice was influenced by his experience documenting the bear attack, leading him to specialize in legal issues related to human-wildlife conflicts and conservation policy. His photographs from the incident would later be featured in wildlife management textbooks and training materials used throughout North America. The Marcus Thompson Memorial Fund, established by his family and co-workers, had raised over $150,000 within 6 months of the incident, providing financial support for his daughter's education while funding wildlife safety research and training programs. The Memorial Fund represented the community's commitment to honoring Marcus's sacrifice by working to prevent similar tragedies. The settlement of legal claims related to the incident was completed 18 months after the attack, with insurance companies paying approximately $4.7 million in property damage, workers' compensation, and liability claims. The legal proceedings had established important precedents for handling wildlife-related workplace accidents and had led to changes in insurance coverage policies for businesses operating in areas with significant wildlife populations. The long-term psychological impact of the incident continued to affect all survivors, with Elena Volkov, David Kowalski, Jennifer Chen, and Timothy Rodriguez all participating in ongoing counseling and support programs designed to help them cope with trauma and rebuild their lives. The incident had created lasting bonds between the survivors while forever changing their perspectives on risk, safety, and the relationship between humans and wildlife. The scientific study of the incident contributed to improved understanding of Kodiak bear behavior and the factors that can lead to dangerous human-wildlife encounters in urban environments. Research papers based on the incident were published in multiple scientific journals and used to develop new wildlife management strategies throughout Alaska and other regions with large predator populations. The implementation of new airport safety protocols based on lessons learned from the incident was completed 2 years after the attack, with similar measures being adopted at airports throughout Alaska and other regions where wildlife encounters posed significant risks. The comprehensive approach to wildlife management, developed in response to the incident, became a model for aviation safety programs worldwide. The dedication of the Marcus Thompson Wildlife Safety Training Center at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport occurred on the 3rd anniversary of the incident, providing a permanent facility for training airport personnel, emergency responders, and wildlife management professionals in dealing with dangerous animal encounters. The training center represented the most tangible legacy of the tragic incident and Marcus's heroic sacrifice. The incident's impact on wildlife management policy extended far beyond Alaska, influencing federal regulations and international aviation safety standards related to wildlife hazards at airports. The comprehensive documentation of the incident and the multi-agency response had created a valuable resource for developing improved safety protocols and training programs used throughout the aviation industry. The May 6, 2024 bear attack at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport remained unique in the annals of human-wildlife conflicts, representing the convergence of multiple unusual factors that created a perfect storm of circumstances leading to tragedy. The incident served as a sobering reminder of the challenges of coexistence between humans and large predators, while demonstrating the courage and professionalism of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The ongoing memorial services held annually on May 6th brought together survivors, emergency responders, airport personnel, and community members to honor Marcus Thompson's memory while reflecting on the lessons learned from the incident. These gatherings served as important opportunities for healing and education, ensuring that the tragedy would not be forgotten and that its lessons would continue to benefit future generations. The comprehensive documentation of the incident, including Timothy Rodriguez's photographs, security footage, radio transmissions, and detailed witness testimony, created one of the most thoroughly recorded wildlife attacks in modern history. This documentation proved invaluable for scientific research, legal proceedings, training programs, and policy development, ensuring that the tragedy would contribute to improved safety and prevention strategies for years to come. The legacy of the May 6, 2024 Anchorage Airport bear attack lived on through the lives changed, the policies reformed, the safety measures implemented, and the memory of Marcus Thompson's heroic sacrifice that saved Elena Volkov's life. The incident demonstrated both the awesome power of Alaska's wildlife and the remarkable courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, creating a story that would be remembered and studied for generations as a testament to human resilience and the complex relationship between civilization and the natural world. The next stories. When the mountain claimed its own. The August heat pressed down on Yellowstone's Lamar Valley like a suffocating blanket as Harold Foster adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and squinted at the road map spread across the RV's dashboard. At 71, his weathered hands still held steady as he traced their planned route with a gnarled finger, though his daughter Sarah noticed the slight tremor that had developed over the past year. "Dad, we don't have to stick to such an aggressive schedule," Sarah said from the passenger seat, watching her father's concentration. "The kids would be just as happy stopping at some of the closer attractions." Harold Foster had spent 43 years as a mechanical engineer for Boeing, meticulously planning every project down to the smallest detail. Retirement hadn't changed his methodical nature. "Nonsense. We've got 3 days to see the park properly, and I'll be damned if we waste them sitting around some overcrowded tourist trap." His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being listened to, though it had grown thinner over the years. Behind them, the 32-foot Winnebago adventurer rumbled down the winding park road, carrying 3 generations of the Foster family on what Harold had declared would be the adventure of a lifetime. The RV, purchased 6 months earlier with his retirement savings, represented Harold's vision of golden years spent exploring America's wild places with his family. Sarah's husband, Mike Chamberlain, gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, constantly checking the side mirrors as they navigated curves barely wide enough for their vehicle. A software developer by trade, Mike was more comfortable with code than wilderness, but he'd agreed to the trip for Sarah's sake. She'd been worried about her father since her mother's death 2 years prior, and this family expedition seemed to rejuvenate Harold in a way nothing else had. "Grandpa, look!" 8-year-old Emma pressed her face against the window, breath fogging the glass. "There's a whole family of elk." Harold twisted in his seat, his face lighting up. "Well, I'll be damned. Sarah, get the camera. Emma, count them for me. 1, 2, 3. There's a baby one, too." Their son Tyler, 12 and typically too cool for family enthusiasm, actually looked up from his handheld gaming device. The sight of the massive elk, their antlers catching the late afternoon sun, commanded attention even from a digitally obsessed preteen. "Can we stop, Dad?" Sarah asked Mike. "There's nowhere to pull over safely," Mike replied, but he slowed the RV to a crawl as they passed the small herd grazing near the roadside. Harold's 2 dogs, Max and Scout, pressed their noses against the rear window, tails wagging furiously at the unfamiliar scents and sounds of the wilderness. Max, a 10-year-old German Shepherd mix, had been Harold's constant companion since Ellen's death. Scout, an energetic 3-year-old Border Collie, had been a recent addition, meant to keep Max company and give Harold someone to talk to during long, quiet evenings. The Foster family had arrived at Yellowstone 3 days earlier, part of a carefully planned 2-week tour of Western national parks. Harold had mapped out their entire route months in advance, booking campsites, planning daily activities, and researching wildlife viewing opportunities with the same precision he'd once applied to aircraft design specifications. Their first 2 days had been picture-perfect. They'd watched Old Faithful erupt on schedule, hiked the easier trails around the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, and spent an evening watching bison graze in Hayden Valley, while Harold regaled them with stories of his own childhood camping trips with his father. "You know," Harold had said that previous evening as they sat around their portable camping chairs outside the RV, "your grandmother and I always planned to do this trip. She had it all marked out in one of those travel guides. Guess it just took me a while to get around to it." Sarah had reached over and squeezed her father's hand, noting how thin it had become. Since Ellen's death, Harold had lost nearly 30 pounds, though he claimed it was because he was finally eating healthy instead of your mother's casseroles. Now, as they made their way toward their final campsite deep in the park's backcountry area, Harold consulted his meticulously planned itinerary. They were running slightly behind schedule due to a longer-than-expected stop at the Norris Geyser Basin, but nothing that couldn't be corrected. "According to this, we should reach the Slough Creek campground by 6:30, Harold announced. "Perfect timing for that elk viewing opportunity the ranger mentioned." The campground Harold had selected was deliberately remote, requiring a drive down a narrow, winding road that discouraged casual visitors. He'd specifically chosen it for its reputation as a prime wildlife viewing location, despite Sarah's gentle suggestions that they might be more comfortable at one of the more developed campgrounds with better facilities. "It's not about comfort," Harold had insisted when booking the site. "It's about experiencing the real wilderness. You can't get that at some RV park with cable hookups and heated bathrooms." Mike navigated carefully down the increasingly narrow road, branches occasionally scraping against the RV's sides. The asphalt gave way to packed dirt, and the thick forest pressed in on both sides, creating a tunnel-like effect that blocked out much of the remaining daylight. "This is pretty remote, Dad," Sarah said, a note of concern creeping into her voice as she watched the dense wilderness pass by their windows. "That's the point, sweetheart. Out here, we'll see wildlife that most park visitors never encounter." According to the ranger, grizzly bears are frequently spotted in this area, especially during berry season. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances. Neither had expressed their shared concern about Harold's recent fascination with potentially dangerous wildlife encounters. Since Ellen's death, he'd developed what Sarah privately described as an edge, a tendency to seek out experiences that bordered on reckless. The Slough Creek campground consisted of just 6 sites carved into a meadow surrounded by dense forest. At this time of day, they had their choice of locations, and Harold directed Mike to the site furthest from the access road, naturally the most isolated spot available. As Mike maneuvered the large RV into position, Harold was already planning their evening activities. "We'll get set up quick." "Then take a walk down to the creek before dark. The ranger said that's the best time to spot bears coming down to drink." "Grandpa," Emma said, pressing against the window again, "it's really dark in those trees." Harold looked where his granddaughter was pointing. The forest surrounding their campsite was dense with lodgepole pines and thick undergrowth. Even in the early evening light, the shadows between the trees created impenetrable darkness. "That's what makes it exciting, Emma. We're in their world now." Mike finished positioning the RV and engaged the parking brake with more force than necessary. Something about this place unsettled him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. Perhaps it was the absolute silence once he turned off the engine. No traffic noise, no human voices, just the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant sound of running water. Harold was the first out of the RV, breathing deeply of the mountain air. "Smell that?" No smog, no city stench, just pure wilderness. Max and Scout bounded out behind him, immediately beginning to explore their new surroundings with intense interest. Both dogs moved with their noses low to the ground, following scent trails invisible to human perception. Sarah noticed that Max, usually calm and controlled, seemed unusually alert. His ears were constantly swiveling, and he occasionally froze in place, staring intently into the forest. Scout, typically playful and scattered in his attention, remained close to Harold's side. "Maybe we should keep the dogs on leashes," Sarah suggested. "Nonsense. They need to stretch their legs. Besides, they're good dogs. They won't wander far." As the family began the process of setting up camp, the forest around them seemed to grow quieter. The birds that had been singing when they arrived gradually fell silent. The wind, which had been rustling through the trees, stilled to barely a whisper. Mike began extending the RV's slide-outs and connecting utilities, while Harold supervised with engineering precision. Tyler and Emma were sent to gather firewood from the designated area, though Emma kept glancing nervously at the dark spaces between the trees. "Mom," Emma whispered to Sarah, "the forest feels like it's watching us." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm evening air. Children, she knew, often picked up on things adults missed. "It's just because we're somewhere new, honey. We're perfectly safe." But as she spoke the words, Sarah noticed that the usual sounds of evening in the wilderness, insects chirping, small animals rustling through underbrush, the calls of birds settling for the night, were notably absent. The silence felt unnatural, expectant. Harold pulled out his expensive camera equipment, adjusting settings for the low-light conditions. Golden hour is perfect for wildlife photography. According to my research, this area has one of the highest concentrations of grizzly activity in the park. Maybe that's not something to be excited about, Mike muttered under his breath, but Harold either didn't hear or chose to ignore the comment. As the family worked to establish their campsite, none of them noticed the massive paw prints in the soft earth just 20 yards from their RV, pressed deep into the ground near a fallen log. The prints were fresh, made sometime that afternoon by something weighing at least 400 pounds. Nor did they see the broken branches, 8 feet off the ground, snapped by an animal marking its territory. The claw marks scored deep into the bark of a nearby pine tree would have told them they were in the territory of a mature male grizzly. But Harold's nature guides hadn't included a section on reading bear sign. Max had found the tracks, however. The German shepherd mix stood perfectly still, every muscle tense, staring into the forest where the scent trail disappeared into the deepening shadows. His hackles were raised, and a low, barely audible growl rumbled in his chest. Scout joined him, and both dogs focused their attention on the same area of forest. Whatever they sensed, there was significant enough to override their usual camp arrival excitement. "What are they looking at?" Tyler asked, following the dog's gaze. The forest stared back, dark and impenetrable, giving no answers. Harold finished adjusting his camera and looked up to see both dogs standing at alert attention. "Probably caught a scent of something interesting." This area's full of wildlife, but animals, unlike humans, understand the language of the wilderness. Max and Scout recognized the scent signatures that marked them as intruders in another predator's domain. Their canine instincts, honed by thousands of years of evolution, screamed warnings that their human companions couldn't interpret. As the sun sank lower behind the mountains, the forest shadows stretched longer, reaching toward their small campsite like grasping fingers. The temperature, which had been pleasantly warm, began to drop with the approaching darkness. Harold checked his watch. 6:45. Perfect timing for that evening wildlife walk I planned. Sarah looked at the increasingly dark forest and the nervous behavior of the dogs. "Dad, maybe we should skip the walk tonight. We could just enjoy the campfire and settle in early." "Sarah, we didn't drive all this way to sit around looking at each other. The ranger specifically recommended evening wildlife viewing in this area. We might see something amazing." Mike stepped closer to his wife. "Harold, the dogs seem pretty spooked by something. Maybe they know something we don't." Harold waved dismissively. "They're just excited by all the new smells. City dogs aren't used to real wilderness. They'll settle down." But Max and Scout showed no signs of settling down. If anything, their alertness seemed to be increasing as darkness approached. Max had positioned himself between the forest and the family, while Scout stayed close to Harold's legs, occasionally whining softly. The temperature continued to drop as full darkness approached. Harold had planned for them to take an evening walk to the creek, but the forest now looked like a solid wall of black. Even the beam of his powerful flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the darkness between the trees. "Maybe the walk can wait until morning," Harold conceded reluctantly. "We'll build up the fire and watch for any wildlife that might come to investigate." Mike felt a wave of relief, though he didn't examine too closely why the idea of venturing into that dark forest had filled him with such dread. They spent the evening around their campfire, Harold sharing stories of his own childhood camping experiences with his father. The firelight created a comfortable circle of warmth and visibility, but beyond its reach, the darkness felt absolute and somehow hostile. "When I was about Tyler's age," Harold said, poking at the fire with a long stick, "my dad took me on a fishing trip up in the Canadian Rockies. We saw a black bear that first night, just at the edge of our firelight. Beautiful creature. It watched us for maybe 10 minutes, then just melted back into the forest." "Were you scared, Grandpa?" Emma asked. "Scared?" "No, honey. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. That's when I knew I wanted to see more wild places, experience more of what nature had to offer. Sarah noticed that her father's eyes held a distant look when he talked about wilderness encounters. Since her mother's death, he'd developed an almost compulsive need to seek out experiences that felt meaningful, authentic, larger than ordinary life. Tyler, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly looked up from the fire. What was that? They all listened. From somewhere in the forest came a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. Max and Scout both came to immediate attention, every muscle tense. Max took a step toward the sound, then thought better of it and moved closer to Harold. "Just the wind," Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound came again, closer this time. It was deep, resonant, and unmistakably alive. Something large was moving through the forest, not far from their campsite. "Should we go inside the RV?" Sarah asked quietly. Harold stood and grabbed his flashlight, shining it toward the source of the sound. The beam reached maybe 30 feet before being absorbed by the darkness. "It's probably just curious about our fire. As long as we don't do anything threatening, we should be fine." But Mike was already standing, positioning himself between the forest and his family. His software developer instincts might not have prepared him for wilderness encounters, but his father instincts were crystal clear. The sound came a third time, and this time they could hear heavy footsteps in the underbrush. Something very large was moving parallel to their campsite, just beyond the reach of their firelight. Both dogs began to growl, low and continuous. Max's hackles were fully raised now, making him look twice his normal size. Scout pressed against Harold's legs, seeking comfort while maintaining a defensive position. "That's definitely a bear," Harold whispered, and there was unmistakable excitement in his voice. For the next 20 minutes, they sat in tense silence around their fire while something moved through the forest around them. Occasionally, they would hear the snap of a broken branch or the rustle of heavy movement through undergrowth, but they never saw whatever was out there. Finally, the sounds faded away, moving deeper into the forest. The dogs gradually relaxed, though they remained alert. "Well," Harold said, his voice shaking slightly with adrenaline, "that was incredible. A real grizzly, probably. Right here at our campsite." "Dad," Sarah said carefully, "maybe we should consider moving to one of the more developed campgrounds tomorrow." Harold looked at her sharply. "Are you kidding? This is exactly what we came here for. How many people get to have an authentic wilderness experience like that?" Mike started banking their fire, making it clear he was ready to retreat to the safety of the RV. "I think we've had enough authentic wilderness for one night." As they prepared to settle in for the night, Harold made one final check around their campsite with his flashlight. He wanted to secure any items that might attract wildlife, though he secretly hoped their visitor might return. The beam of his flashlight swept across their picnic table, the area around their fire, and the edge of the forest. As the light passed over a large pine tree at the edge of their camp, Harold stopped. There, clearly visible in the bark about 8 feet off the ground, were 5 parallel gouges scored deep into the wood. The claw marks were fresh, and they were enormous. Harold stood staring at the tree for a long moment, calculating. Whatever had made those marks was large enough to reach 8 feet while standing on its hind legs, and powerful enough to rake deep furrows in solid wood. He decided not to mention the claw marks to the rest of his family. Inside the RV, they settled in for the night with the kind of forced casualness that comes after a brush with something wild and unpredictable. Mike checked all the locks twice, though he wasn't sure how effective the RV's standard door locks would be against something capable of making the sounds they'd heard. Harold lay in his bed at the rear of the RV, listening to the forest sounds outside. The silence from earlier had been replaced by what seemed like normal nighttime wilderness noise. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant sound of water moving over rocks. But something felt different. Harold had spent enough time in wild places to recognize when the natural rhythm of a forest was disturbed. Tonight, the sounds seemed muted, careful, as if every creature was trying not to draw attention to itself. Max and Scout both remained restless, occasionally padding to the windows and staring out into the darkness. Max, in particular, seemed unable to settle, moving from window to window as if tracking something moving around the perimeter of their camp. Around midnight, Harold was startled awake by a sound that made his blood run cold. From somewhere very close to their RV came a deep, huffing grunt, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving around their campsite. Harold slipped out of bed as quietly as possible and moved to the small window above his bedside table. Pressing his face to the glass, he peered out into the darkness, but the night was too black to see anything beyond a few feet from the RV. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. Whatever was out there seemed to be conducting a thorough investigation of their campsite, moving around the RV, checking their picnic table, investigating their fire pit. Harold lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to every sound, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. This was the kind of authentic wilderness experience he'd been hoping for, even if it was more intense than he'd expected. When dawn finally began to lighten the sky, Harold was the first one up. He made coffee quietly, trying not to wake the rest of the family, and stepped outside to survey their campsite. What he found made him catch his breath. The dirt around their RV was crisscrossed with massive paw prints. Not the neat, distinct prints he might have expected, but deep impressions left by something that had circled their campsite repeatedly during the night. The prints led from the forest to their picnic table, around the RV to their fire pit, and back to the forest again. Whatever had visited them during the night had been conducting a systematic investigation of their camp. Harold knelt down next to the clearest print. It was huge, easily 6 inches wide and 8 inches long, with clear claw marks extending beyond the toe pads. The depth of the impression in the hard-packed dirt suggested an animal of enormous weight. But what made Harold's hands shake as he examined the print was not its size, but its freshness. The edges were sharp and clean, made sometime in the early hours of the morning. Sarah emerged from the RV, yawning and holding a cup of coffee. "Morning, Dad. How did you sleep?" Harold stood quickly, positioning himself to block her view of the most obvious prints. "Fine, fine. Beautiful morning, isn't it?" But Sarah's attention was caught by movement at the edge of the forest. "Dad, look!" Harold turned to follow her gaze and felt his stomach drop. At the tree line, perhaps 50 yards from their camp, stood the largest grizzly bear he had ever seen. The animal was massive, easily 7 feet tall at the shoulder, with dark brown fur that seemed almost black in the early morning light. It stood perfectly still, watching their campsite with the kind of focused attention that suggested intelligence and intent. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. The bear's massive head turned toward the sound of her voice, fixing them with a direct stare that seemed to look right through them. For a long moment, human and animal regarded each other across the meadow. Harold reached for his camera, but the movement caused the bear to shift its weight, a subtle change in posture that somehow communicated warning. "Don't move," Harold whispered. "Don't make any sudden movements." The bear continued to watch them for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then, with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and melted back into the forest. Harold and Sarah stood frozen for several more minutes, neither wanting to break the spell of what they had just witnessed. "Dad," Sarah finally said, her voice shaky, "that was incredible, but also terrifying. Maybe we should think about packing up early today. Harold's mind was racing. The bear encounter, the nighttime investigation of their camp, the massive tracks around their RV, it all added up to something he wasn't sure he was prepared for. But the rational part of his mind, the engineer who had spent decades analyzing risks and calculating probabilities, was being overruled by something else. The bear encounter had been magnificent, primal, unlike anything he had experienced in his carefully ordered life. "Actually," Harold said slowly, "I think we should extend our stay another day." Sarah stared at her father. "Dad, that bear was enormous. It spent last night walking around our RV. That's not normal behavior." "That's exactly why we should stay." "Sarah, how many people ever get to observe grisly behavior like this? We're being given a rare opportunity to witness something extraordinary." "Or to become something extraordinary for that bear to eat," Mike's voice came from the RV doorway. He had obviously heard at least part of their conversation. Harold turned to face his son-in-law. "Mike, that bear could have approached our RV directly last night if it had aggressive intentions. Instead, it kept its distance, observed us, and left us alone. That suggests intelligence and caution, not aggression." "It also suggests a bear that's becoming habituated to human presence," Mike replied, "which, according to every Park Service pamphlet I've read, is exactly the kind of bear that becomes dangerous." The debate continued through breakfast, with Harold insisting they stay another night, and the rest of the family growing increasingly uncomfortable with the idea. The compromise they reached was to stay one more day, but to take precautions, keep all food locked inside the RV, maintain constant awareness of their surroundings, and be prepared to leave immediately if the bear returned. Harold agreed to the conditions, but privately, he hoped the bear would return. The encounter had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Ellen's death, a sense of being fully alive, completely present in a moment of significance. Tyler and Emma spent the morning inside the RV, occasionally peeking out the windows, but showing no interest in exploring their surroundings. The bear encounter had affected them differently than their grandfather. Where Harold saw wonder and opportunity, they saw threat and unpredictability. Mike spent the morning checking and rechecking their departure preparations, making sure they could pack up and leave quickly if necessary. His software developer mind approached the problem methodically, identify potential threats, develop response protocols, maintain multiple exit strategies. Sarah found herself torn between her father's enthusiasm and her family's safety. She understood Harold's desire for meaningful experiences, especially in the wake of Ellen's death, but she also recognized that his judgment might be clouded by grief and a need to feel alive again. The dogs, Max and Scout, remained on high alert throughout the morning. Both animals seemed to understand that something significant had changed in their environment. They stayed close to the humans, avoided the areas of the campsite where the bear tracks were most prominent, and frequently stared into the forest with focused attention. Around noon, Harold suggested they take a short hike to Slough Creek to see the area where the bear might come to drink. The suggestion was met with immediate resistance from Mike and Sarah, but Harold pressed his case. "We'll stay together, we'll make noise to avoid surprising anything, and we'll carry bear spray." It's a quarter-mile walk in broad daylight on a well-established trail. Tyler surprised everyone by supporting his grandfather. "I want to see where the bear lives." The walk to the creek was tense but uneventful. They followed a narrow trail through dense forest, Harold leading with bear spray in hand, and Mike bringing up the rear with similar equipment. Sarah stayed between the children, constantly scanning the forest around them. Slough Creek, when they reached it, was beautiful in the way that only wilderness water can be. Clear, cold and fast-moving, it flowed over granite boulders and around fallen logs, with the sound that had lulled them to sleep the previous night. Harold pointed out the muddy areas along the bank where various animals came to drink, There were elk tracks, deer tracks, and what looked like the paw prints of several different carnivores. "This is like a highway for wildlife," Harold explained to Tyler and Emma. "Everything in this area depends on this water source." Emma knelt down next to a clear set of tracks in the mud. "Grandpa, are these from our bear?" Harold examined the prints. They were definitely from a large bear, though whether it was the same animal they had encountered that morning was impossible to determine. The tracks were headed upstream, following the creek deeper into the wilderness. "Could be, honey. Bears follow the same trails and use the same water sources as other animals." Tyler had wandered a few yards downstream, examining an area where something large had disturbed the bank. "Grandpa, come look at this." Harold joined his grandson and immediately saw what had caught Tyler's attention. A section of the creek bank had been torn up, as if something very powerful had been digging or foraging in the soft soil. "What was it looking for?" Tyler asked. "Could be roots, insects, small rodents. Bears are omnivores. They eat whatever they can find." But Harold noticed something else that he didn't mention to Tyler. Mixed in with the disturbed soil were the scattered remains of what looked like a fish, and the torn earth showed claw marks that matched the size of the prints around their campsite. Whatever had done this digging was not just large, but also very strong, capable of moving significant amounts of earth and stone in its search for food. They returned to their campsite without incident, but Harold's mind was working on the implications of what they had seen. The bear was actively foraging in the area around their camp, which meant it considered this part of its territory. Their presence was an intrusion into the daily patterns of a very large, very powerful wild animal. The afternoon passed quietly, with the family staying close to their RV and Harold periodically scanning the forest with his binoculars. He was hoping for another glimpse of the bear, but the forest remained still and seemingly empty. As evening approached, the tension in the camp became palpable. Everyone was thinking about the previous night's visit, wondering if their massive neighbor would return for another investigation. Harold prepared dinner on their portable camp stove, taking extra care to clean up immediately and store all food inside the RV. The bear's safety protocols were being followed to the letter, but Harold secretly hoped they wouldn't be enough to discourage another visit. The sun set earlier than the previous night, due to cloud cover moving in from the west. The forest seemed to grow dark more quickly, and the shadows between the trees deepened into impenetrable blackness by 7:30. Harold built their campfire smaller than the night before, reasoning that a less prominent fire might not discourage wildlife from approaching, but wouldn't present an aggressive challenge either. The family sat around the fire in tense conversation, everyone listening to the forest sounds and trying to distinguish between normal nighttime wilderness noise and something more significant. Around 8:30, Max and Scout both came to immediate alert attention, staring fixedly into the forest to the south of their campsite. The hackles on both dogs were raised, and Max began to emit a low, continuous growl. "Here we go again," Mike muttered, moving closer to Sarah and the children. Harold grabbed his flashlight and shined it in the direction the dogs were focused on. The beam penetrated maybe 20 feet into the forest before being absorbed by the darkness. They waited in tense silence for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. The dogs remained at full alert, but no sounds came from the forest. Then, without warning, something crashed through the underbrush to their left, on the opposite side of their camp from where the dogs were watching. Harold spun around, his flashlight beams sweeping wildly across the forest. What the hell? The crashing sound moved parallel to their campsite, heavy and fast, something large moving through dense forest without regard for stealth. "It's circling us," Mike said grimly. "Get everyone inside the RV, now." But before they could move, the crashing stopped. The forest fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It felt like the held breath before an explosion. Harold kept his flashlight trained on the forest, sweeping it back and forth, trying to penetrate the darkness. Sarah began moving Tyler and Emma toward the RV, but slowly, trying not to trigger a charge from whatever was out there. Then Harold's flashlight beam caught something that made his blood freeze. Two eyes, reflecting the light like green mirrors, staring at them from the darkness about 30 feet from their fire. The eyes were enormous and set wide apart, at least 7 feet off the ground. As Harold watched, frozen with terror and fascination, the eyes moved slightly, and he could make out the massive shadow of the animal behind them. The grizzly had returned, and this time it was much closer. Harold's hands shook as he tried to keep the flashlight beam steady on those enormous eyes. The bear remained perfectly motionless, watching them with an intelligence that was both magnificent and terrifying. "Dad," Sarah whispered urgently, slowly back toward the RV. But Harold seemed transfixed by the sight of the massive predator. This was the authentic wilderness experience he had been seeking, but the reality of it was more overwhelming than he had anticipated. The bear took a step forward, just one step, but it brought the animal to the very edge of their firelight. Now they could see it clearly. The massive head, the powerful shoulders, the size of an animal that could weigh 600 or 700 pounds. Max and Scout both began barking, sharp, aggressive barks that echoed through the forest. The sound seemed to startle the bear, which took a step back, but then lowered its head and made a sound that was part grunt, part growl, and completely unmistakable as a warning. "Everyone in the RV," Mike commanded. "Right now. Don't run, but move." The family began backing slowly toward their RV, Harold reluctantly following while keeping his flashlight trained on the bear. The animal watched their retreat, but didn't follow, maintaining its position at the edge of their firelight. Once inside the RV with the door locked, they pressed against the windows, trying to see what the bear was doing. Harold's flashlight beam revealed that it had moved closer to their fire, investigating the area they had just vacated. "It's examining our campsite," Harold whispered. "Look how methodically it's checking everything. The bear spent nearly an hour investigating every aspect of their camp. It sniffed around their fire pit, examined their picnic table, and walked completely around the RV, occasionally pressing its nose against the lower panels. When it finally left, moving back into the forest with surprising quietness for such a large animal, the family remained inside the RV for another hour, afraid to venture outside. "That's it," Mike announced. "We're leaving first thing in the morning." This isn't wildlife observation anymore. This is a dangerous situation. Harold wanted to argue, but the intensity of the encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. The bear's behavior was not that of an animal simply curious about human presence. There was something deliberate, almost calculating, about the way it had approached their camp. They spent another restless night, with various family members taking turns watching the windows for any sign of their large neighbor. The bear didn't return, but none of them slept well. Dawn came grey and cloudy, with a chill in the air that suggested weather moving in from the mountains. Harold was again the first one up, and his survey of their campsite revealed the same pattern as the previous morning. Massive paw prints circling the RV, but this time the prints were deeper, more numerous, and closer to their vehicle. The bear had spent considerable time investigating every aspect of their camp, including areas directly under their RV's slides and awnings. Harold stood in the grey morning light, studying the tracks and trying to understand what was happening. In his research on grizzly behavior, he had read about problem bears that became habituated to human food sources, but this didn't seem to fit that pattern. They had been meticulous about securing their food. What he was seeing looked more like territorial behavior. as if the bear considered their presence an intrusion that needed to be investigated and evaluated. Mike emerged from the RV already dressed and ready to begin packing up. "How bad is it out here?" Harold pointed to the tracks. "It spent a lot of time checking us out last night." Mike knelt down next to one of the clearer prints and felt his stomach tighten. The print was enormous, and the depth of the impression suggested an animal of truly impressive size and weight. "Harold, this isn't normal. We need to report this to the park rangers and get out of here." For the first time since they had arrived, Harold felt a chill of real fear rather than excitement. The bear's behavior was escalating, becoming more bold and more focused on their specific campsite. "You're right," Harold said quietly. "Let's pack up and head out. We can stop at the ranger station on our way to the next campground." The family worked quickly to break camp, everyone eager to put distance between themselves and their large neighbor. Harold took a few final photographs of the tracks, thinking they might be important for the rangers to see. As Mike maneuvered the RV out of their campsite and back onto the narrow dirt road, Sarah noticed that both Max and Scout were more relaxed than they had been for the past 2 days. The dogs seemed to understand that they were leaving the bear's territory, but their relief was premature. They had traveled less than half a mile down the narrow dirt road when Mike suddenly hit the brakes, bringing the RV to an abrupt stop. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Mike pointed ahead through the windshield. "That!" Blocking the road approximately 50 yards ahead of them was the massive grizzly bear. It stood directly in the center of the narrow track, facing their RV, and showed no inclination to move aside. Harold grabbed his binoculars for a better look. The bear was even larger than he had realized, with a massive head and shoulders that seemed to fill the entire width of the road. "Why isn't it moving?" Tyler asked. That was exactly the question that was troubling Harold. In all his research on bear behavior, he had never read about an animal deliberately blocking a road to prevent humans from leaving its territory. Mike tried honking the horn, a few short blasts that echoed through the forest. The bear turned its head toward the sound, but didn't move from the road. "Try backing up," Sarah suggested. "Maybe we can find a place wide enough to turn around." Mike began carefully backing the large RV down the narrow road, using his mirrors to avoid hitting trees on either side. But after about 100 yards, he stopped. "There's another problem," he said quietly. Harold turned to look out the rear window and felt his blood run cold. Behind them, perhaps 30 yards back, was a second bear. This one was slightly smaller than the first, but it was also positioned in the center of the road. They were trapped between 2 grizzly bears on a narrow dirt road with no room to maneuver and no way to escape. Harold's mind raced through the implications. 2 bears coordinating to block their escape route was beyond unusual. It was unprecedented in everything he had read about grizzly behavior. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice calm for the children's sake. Mike considered their options. The RV was large and heavy enough that it probably couldn't be overturned by even a very large bear, but they were effectively imprisoned inside it as long as the animals maintained their positions. "We wait," he said finally, "and we call for help." Harold pulled out his cell phone, but as he expected in this remote area, there was no signal. They were on their own, with 2 massive grizzly bears and no way to communicate with the outside world. For the next hour, they remained trapped in their RV, while the 2 bears maintained their positions on the road. Occasionally, one or the other would move slightly, but neither showed any inclination to leave. Harold used the time to observe the animals through binoculars, trying to understand their behavior. Both bears appeared calm and patient, as if they were prepared to maintain their blockade indefinitely. "This is like nothing I've ever read about," Harold muttered. "Grizzlies don't cooperate like this, and they certainly don't trap humans." But the evidence was right in front of them. For reasons they couldn't understand, these 2 massive predators had decided to prevent their departure from the area. Around mid-morning, the weather began to deteriorate. Clouds that had been building since dawn finally began to release their moisture in the form of a cold, steady rain. The rain made visibility worse and added another layer of misery to their situation. Harold watched through the streaming windshield as the bear in front of them simply sat down in the middle of the road, apparently prepared to wait out the storm. "How long can this go on?" Emma asked. No one had an answer for her. By noon, the situation had become surreal. They were trapped in their RV by two bears who seemed to have nothing better to do than prevent their departure. The animals showed no signs of hunger, aggression, or impatience, just a stubborn determination to maintain their roadblock. Harold had been taking photographs and making notes, thinking that if they survived this experience, wildlife researchers would want to understand what had happened. But his initial excitement about observing unusual bear behavior was giving way to genuine concern for his family's safety. The rain continued throughout the afternoon, turning the dirt road into mud and making their situation even more precarious. Even if the bears moved aside, Mike wasn't sure they would be able to navigate the increasingly treacherous road conditions. Around 4 o'clock, Tyler announced that he needed to use the bathroom. The RV's facilities were adequate, but the waste tanks were approaching capacity after 3 days of use. "How long before we have a real problem with the tanks?" Sarah asked Mike quietly. "Maybe 2 more days if we're careful," Mike replied, "but that assumes we can get to a dump station." The implications were unsettling. If the bears maintained their blockade much longer, the family would face increasingly serious practical problems: waste disposal, food supplies, and fresh water. Harold continued his observations of the bears, trying to understand their motivation. Neither animal showed signs of being attracted to their food supplies. If anything, they seemed focused on the RV itself, as if the vehicle represented some kind of threat that needed to be contained. As evening approached, the rain finally stopped, but the two bears remained in position. Harold suggested that they try moving slowly forward, hoping that the animals would eventually yield the road. Mike crept the RV forward at walking speed, but as they approached the bear blocking their path, the massive animal stood up and took a few steps toward them, clearly indicating that passage would not be permitted. "Okay, that's not going to work," Mike said, putting the RV back into reverse. They spent their 3rd night in the remote campsite, but this time as involuntary prisoners rather than willing campers. The bears maintained their positions throughout the night, apparently taking shifts so that one was always blocking each end of the road. Harold lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to process what was happening to them. In his 61 years, 43 of them as an engineer accustomed to solving problems through logic and analysis, he had never encountered a situation that defied rational explanation so completely. Bears, he knew, were intelligent animals, but what they were experiencing suggested a level of planning and cooperation that challenged everything he understood about grizzly behavior. The next morning brought clear skies, but no change in their situation. Both bears were still in position, and if anything, they seemed more settled and determined than before. Harold emerged from the RV to survey their surroundings more carefully, looking for any alternative escape route. The forest on both sides of the road was too dense and steep for an RV to navigate, but he wondered if the family could escape on foot. As soon as he stepped outside, however, both bears turned their attention to him. The message was clear. He was permitted to move around their immediate campsite, but any attempt to leave the area would not be tolerated. Max and Scout had adapted to the situation by staying as close to the RV as possible. Both dogs seemed to understand that they were in the territory of creatures much larger and more powerful than themselves. By the 4th morning of their enforced captivity, practical concerns were becoming urgent. Their fresh water supply was running low. The waste tanks were nearly full, and their food supplies, while adequate, were not unlimited. More seriously, Harold was beginning to notice changes in his family's behavior. Tyler had become withdrawn and irritable, Emma was having nightmares, and Sarah was showing signs of the kind of stress that comes from feeling helpless and trapped. Mike had taken to obsessive checking of their various systems and supplies, creating detailed inventories and calculating how long they could maintain their current situation. His engineer's mind was trying to solve an unsolvable problem. On the fourth afternoon, Harold made a decision that he knew was risky, but felt was necessary. He loaded one of their emergency flares and prepared to fire it into the sky, hoping that park rangers or other campers might see the distress signal. As soon as he stepped out of the RV with the flare gun, however, both bears immediately stood and began moving toward their position. Harold hastily retreated inside the RV, but the message had been received. Any attempt to signal for help would be prevented. The bears' behavior was not only unprecedented, it was becoming genuinely frightening. These were not animals simply defending territory or investigating unusual scents. They were demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that suggested they understood the human situation and were deliberately preventing their escape. That evening, as the family sat inside their RV trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine, Harold finally articulated what they were all thinking. "I think we need to consider the possibility that we're not getting out of here on our own." Sarah looked at her father sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, these bears aren't going to just get bored and wander away. They're keeping us here deliberately, for reasons we don't understand." Mike had been coming to the same conclusion. "So, what are our options?" Harold had been thinking about that question for hours. "We can wait and hope someone comes looking for us. We can try to signal for help, despite the bear's reaction, or we can attempt to leave on foot." Each option carried significant risks. No one knew where they were, except the park rangers who had recommended the remote campsite, and they weren't expected anywhere else for several days. Signaling for help might provoke the bears into more aggressive behavior, and attempting to escape on foot through dense forest while being pursued by two massive grizzlies was almost certainly suicidal. "How long before people start looking for us?" Tyler asked. Harold consulted their itinerary. "We're supposed to be at Grand Teton in 3 days. If we don't show up for our reservation, they might contact the Park Service, but that could take several more days." The realization that they might be trapped for a week or more sent a chill through the family. Their supplies wouldn't last that long, and the psychological pressure of being prisoners was already taking its toll. That night, Harold made another disturbing discovery. While conducting his evening survey of their campsite, he found additional bear tracks, not just from their two captors, but from at least one other animal. The tracks were smaller and showed a different gait pattern, suggesting a third bear that had been observing their situation but staying out of sight. Harold decided not to share this information with the rest of his family. They were already stressed enough without knowing that their situation might be even more complex than they realized. The 5th day of their captivity began with a development that filled Harold with both hope and terror. Around mid-morning, they heard the distant sound of an engine echoing through the forest. Someone else was coming down the road. Harold grabbed his binoculars and positioned himself at the front window of the RV, trying to see past the bear that was blocking their forward progress. Through the trees, he could make out a Park Service pickup truck slowly making its way down the muddy road. Behind it was a second vehicle, possibly another ranger or a search team. "Thank God," Sarah breathed. "Someone's coming to help us." But Harold watched with growing apprehension as the lead vehicle approached the position where the first bear was standing. Instead of stopping or turning around when the driver saw the massive grizzly, the pickup truck continued forward at the same slow, careful pace. The bear, for its part, showed no inclination to move aside. If anything, it seemed to be positioning itself more deliberately in the center of the road. What happened next would be burned into Harold's memory for the rest of his life. The pickup truck still moving slowly, came within 20 feet of the bear before the driver apparently realized that the animal was not going to yield the road. Harold could see the truck brake hard, wheels locking in the muddy surface. The bear, massive and powerful and apparently territorial beyond all normal behavior, charged. Harold watched in horror as 700 pounds of grizzly bear hit the front of the pickup truck with enough force to lift the front wheels off the ground. The sound of crushing metal and breaking glass echoed through the forest like an explosion. The truck's driver, whether from impact or terror, lost control of the vehicle. It slid sideways in the mud, tipped up on two wheels, and rolled over with a tremendous crash that shook the ground and sent birds exploding from the nearby trees. The bear, apparently satisfied with the destruction it had caused, stood over the overturned vehicle for a moment, then calmly walked back to its position in the middle of the road. Harold's family sat in stunned silence, staring at the wreckage of what had been their rescue. The pickup truck lay on its side in the forest, steam rising from its crushed engine compartment, while the massive grizzly resumed its patient blockade of their escape route. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "Is whoever was in that truck?" Harold was already moving, grabbing the first aid kit from their emergency supplies. "I have to go help them." But as soon as he opened the RV door, both bears, the one that had attacked the truck and the one blocking the rear of the road, immediately focused their attention on him. The message was unmistakable. He would not be permitted to approach the wreckage. For the next hour, they watched helplessly as smoke rose from the overturned truck. Occasionally, they thought they could hear sounds from inside the wreckage, tapping or calls for help, but the bears maintained their positions, preventing any rescue attempt. Harold felt a crushing weight of guilt and helplessness. Someone had come to help them, and now that person was trapped in an overturned vehicle while Harold and his family sat safely in their RV, unable to provide assistance. By afternoon, the sounds from the wreckage had stopped. The realization that someone had probably died trying to rescue them changed everything for Harold's family. This was no longer an unusual wildlife encounter or even a dangerous situation. It was a life-and-death crisis that had already claimed at least one victim. Mike took charge of their emergency preparations. "We need to assume that we're on our own indefinitely. Water conservation is now critical. Food needs to be rationed, and we need to find a way to signal for help that doesn't provoke the bears." Harold felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. His insistence on seeking an authentic wilderness experience had led his family into a situation that was beyond dangerous. It was potentially fatal. That evening, as they sat around their small table trying to ration their remaining food supplies, Emma asked the question that everyone was thinking: "Are we going to die here?" Harold looked at his granddaughter's frightened face and felt something break inside his chest. The adventure he had planned as a way to connect with his family and fill the emptiness left by Ellen's death had become a nightmare that might cost them all their lives. "No, honey," he said, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "We're going to find a way out of this." But as he spoke, Harold could see the overturned rescue vehicle through the RV's window, and he knew that their situation was more desperate than he had ever imagined. The bears had demonstrated that they were not simply territorial animals defending their space. They were actively preventing any human from entering or leaving the area, and they were prepared to use lethal force to maintain their blockade. Harold Foster, who had spent his entire career solving engineering problems through careful analysis and methodical planning, was facing a problem that had no rational solution. His family was trapped in the wilderness by intelligent predators whose motivation he couldn't understand, whose behavior defied every scientific study he had read, and whose capabilities far exceeded anything he had prepared for. Outside their RV, two massive grizzly bears maintained their patient vigil. and beyond them, the wreckage of a failed rescue attempt served as a grim reminder of the stakes they were facing. Harold sat in the gathering darkness of their sixth night of captivity, listening to the sounds of the forest, and wondering if his quest for an authentic wilderness experience would end with authentic wilderness death. The bears had claimed their territory, and Harold's family had become unwilling subjects in a demonstration of wild power that transcended anything in his understanding of the natural world. In the morning, he would have to begin planning their escape, but tonight, Harold Foster could only sit with his family in their aluminum prison and wonder what force of nature they had wandered into, and whether any of them would live to tell the story. The next stories, August 3rd, 2024. Grizzly bear kills 2 police officers in remote Wyoming station. The first sign that something was wrong came at 3:47 a.m. when the emergency radio at the Fremont County Sheriff's Department crackled to life with nothing but static, followed by what dispatcher Jennifer Martinez would later describe as sounds I'll never forget, screaming, then roaring, then silence that lasted forever. The call originated from remote station Charlie 7, a weathered log cabin that served as an outpost for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, nestled deep in the Wind River Range, approximately 43 miles northeast of Dubois, Wyoming. The station sat at an elevation of 8,200 feet, surrounded by dense lodgepole pine forest and accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through bear country for the final 18 miles. Officer Robert James Collins, 36 years old, had been stationed there for what was supposed to be a routine 3-day wildlife monitoring assignment. A 12-year veteran of the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, Collins stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with graying brown hair and hands scarred from years of outdoor work. He had grown up in Riverton, Wyoming, the son of a rancher who had taught him to respect the wilderness while never letting his guard down. Collins had volunteered for the remote assignment partly because he needed the overtime pay to help with his daughter's college tuition, and partly because he genuinely enjoyed the solitude of the high country. His wife, Sarah, had kissed him goodbye that Tuesday morning, with the usual mixture of worry and resignation that came with being married to a law enforcement officer in one of the most sparsely populated counties in America. Officer Megan Elizabeth Shaw, 31, had joined him at the station on Thursday afternoon. Shaw was relatively new to the department, having transferred from the Cheyenne Police Department just 8 months earlier after her divorce was finalized. She had grown tired of urban policing and was drawn to the idea of working in an area where she could combine law enforcement with her lifelong love of the outdoors. Shaw stood 5 feet 6 inches with auburn hair that she kept pulled back in a regulation ponytail and green eyes that missed nothing during her patrols. She had been an avid hiker and backpacker since high school, and colleagues often remarked that she seemed more at home in the wilderness than in town. Her decision to take the remote assignment had been impulsive. Collins had mentioned needing a partner for the final 2 days, and Shaw had volunteered immediately, seeing it as an opportunity to learn the backcountry areas she would be responsible for patrolling. Remote Station Charlie 7 had been built in 1987 as part of a network of wilderness outposts designed to provide law enforcement and wildlife management personnel with a base of operations in areas too remote for daily commuting. The cabin measured 24 feet by 36 feet, constructed of 8-inch diameter lodgepole pine logs with chinking that had been recently updated to modern synthetic materials. The structure featured a steep metal roof designed to shed heavy snow loads and sat on a foundation of concrete piers that raised it 18 inches off the ground. Inside, the cabin was divided into 4 main areas: a combination kitchen and communications center, a sleeping area with 4 bunk beds, a small office space with filing cabinets and reference materials, and a storage room for emergency supplies and equipment. The communication setup included a high-powered radio system with a 70-foot antenna tower that could reach the county dispatch center under normal conditions, though atmospheric interference was common in the mountainous terrain. Solar panels and a backup generator provided electricity, while a wood-burning stove supplemented the propane heater during cold weather. The cabin was stocked with enough food and supplies to sustain 4 people for up to 2 weeks in case of emergency. Though assignments typically lasted no more than 5 days, the nearest neighbor was Dr. Eleanor Patricia Whitman, a retired wildlife biologist who maintained a small research cabin approximately 2.5 miles northeast of the station. At 73 years old, Dr. Whitman had spent the last 15 years of her retirement documenting grizzly bear behavior in the region, work that had earned her considerable respect among wildlife management professionals. Her cabin was accessible only by foot trail, as she had deliberately chosen a location that discouraged casual visitors. Dr. Whitman had first encountered Collins during his previous assignments to the area, and the two had developed a mutual respect based on their shared appreciation for the wilderness and understanding of its dangers. On the morning of August 3rd, Dr. Whitman had been awake since 4:30 a.m., as was her custom. She maintained detailed logs of weather conditions, animal sightings, and unusual occurrences, part of the informal monitoring network that helped officials track wildlife patterns. Her cabin sat on a slight ridge that provided a clear view across the valley toward Station Charlie 7. Though the distance and intervening forest made it impossible to see the building directly. What she could observe, however, was the antenna tower with its blinking red warning light, which had become a familiar landmark during her early morning observations. The weather on August 2nd had been unseasonably warm for the high elevation, with afternoon temperatures reaching into the mid-70s Fahrenheit. A weak, cold front had moved through during the evening, bringing scattered thunder showers and dropping the temperature to the low 40s by midnight. The humidity remained high, creating ideal conditions for scent to carry long distances through the forest. A gentle breeze from the southwest had persisted through the night, barely strong enough to rustle the aspen leaves, but sufficient to carry odors across miles of terrain. Collins and Shaw had spent the previous day conducting routine patrols and maintenance tasks around the station. Their primary mission was to monitor for illegal camping and hunting activities in the area, as the remote location made it attractive to people seeking to avoid official oversight. They had also been tasked with conducting a census of elk herds in preparation for the fall hunting season, work that required hiking several miles along established game trails while recording GPS coordinates and population estimates. During their afternoon patrol on August 2nd, both officers had noticed an unusual amount of fresh bear sign in the area. Scat, claw marks on trees, and overturned rocks suggested at least one large grizzly had been active in the immediate vicinity within the past 24 to 48 hours. Shaw had photographed several sets of tracks near a small creek approximately half a mile from the station, measurements indicating a bear with front paws measuring nearly 10 inches across, suggesting an adult male of considerable size. "These are some of the biggest tracks I've seen," Shaw had remarked, while kneeling beside a particularly clear print in the creek bank mud. The track showed the distinctive long claws of a grizzly bear, with the front claws extending nearly 4 inches beyond the toe pads. The depth of the impression suggested an animal weighing at least 600 pounds, possibly more. Collins had studied the tracks with the experienced eye of someone who had grown up in bear country. "Definitely a boar," he had agreed, "and he's been through here recently. Look how sharp those edges are." He had pointed to the clearly defined ridges of mud displaced by the bear's weight, In this humidity, these would start to soften and blur within a few hours. They had followed the trail for approximately 100 yards before losing it on hard ground, but the direction appeared to lead toward a series of huckleberry patches that were known to attract bears during the late summer months. Both officers had made note of the sighting in their daily reports and had taken additional precautions that evening, ensuring all food was properly stored and checking the cabin's bear-resistant containers. The station's food storage system consisted of 2 steel lockers designed specifically for bear country installations. Each locker measured 4 feet wide by 3 feet deep by 3 feet tall, constructed of 1/4-inch steel plate with locking mechanisms that required human dexterity to operate. One locker contained their personal food supplies, while the other held emergency rations and supplies that were maintained year-round. Both lockers were positioned approximately 50 feet from the main cabin, following best practices for wildlife management in bear habitat. Shaw had prepared dinner that evening. Freeze-dried beef stroganoff rehydrated with hot water, supplemented with canned green beans and instant mashed potatoes. They had eaten by lamplight while reviewing maps of the area they planned to patrol the following day. Collins had seemed relaxed and talkative, sharing stories of previous assignments and offering advice about working in the remote areas of the county. "The thing about bear country," Collins had said while cleaning his dinner plate, "is that 99% of the time they want nothing to do with you. A bear's got better things to do than mess with humans, but that 1%, that's when your training matters." He had gestured toward the radio equipment. "First rule is always stay in communication. Second rule is never assume you can predict what any wild animal is going to do." Shaw had listened attentively while making notes in her field journal, a habit she had maintained since her academy days. "What about the stories you hear? Bears that actively hunt people?" she had asked. "Rare, but it happens," Collins had replied. "Usually it's a bear that's injured or sick, or maybe one that's had some kind of bad experience with humans that's changed its behavior. Most predatory attacks happen in September and October when the bears are trying to put on weight before hibernation. But again, extremely rare. In Wyoming, you're statistically more likely to be struck by lightning than killed by a bear." They had finished their meal around 8:30 p.m. and had spent another hour reviewing protocols and checking equipment. Shaw had tested the radio system, confirming clear communication with the dispatch center in Lander. The evening routine included a security check of the cabin's exterior, examining the doors and windows for any signs of animal interference. The cabin's doors were constructed of solid oak, reinforced with steel plates, and the windows were covered with heavy-gauge steel mesh designed to prevent break-ins by both humans and large animals. Collins had conducted the evening security check while Shaw organized their gear for the next day's patrol. The property around the cabin showed no signs of recent animal activity, though he had noticed that the bear-resistant garbage container had been investigated by some creature during their absence. Scratch marks on the steel surface and disturbed ground around the base indicated that something had tested the container's security but had been unable to gain access. Both officers had been in their bunks by 10:15 p.m., following a final radio check with dispatch. Shaw had taken the bottom bunk on the left side of the sleeping area, while Collins occupied the bottom bunk on the right. They had left one small LED lantern burning on the communications table, providing enough light to navigate the cabin's interior while preserving their night vision in case of emergency. The first disturbance occurred at approximately 2:20 a.m., though neither officer was initially awakened by it. Dr. Whitman, conducting one of her periodic nighttime observations from her cabin porch, had heard what she later described as a sound like someone throwing a large rock against a tree, followed by a crashing noise. The sound had come from the general direction of Station Charlie 7, though the distance and intervening terrain made it impossible to determine the exact source. At 2:47 a.m., Collins had awakened to the sound of something moving around the exterior of the cabin. His training and experience had taught him to remain motionless and listen carefully when awakened by unusual sounds in the wilderness. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate. Footsteps of something large moving slowly around the building. Collins had reached for the flashlight beside his bunk while straining to identify the source of the noise. "Shaw," he had whispered, trying to wake his partner without making enough noise to alert whatever was outside. Shaw had come instantly awake, her police training allowing her to transition from sleep to full alertness within seconds. "What is it?" she had whispered back. "Something's outside," Collins had replied quietly. "Big, moving around the building." Both officers had remained motionless in their bunks, listening to the sounds from outside. The footsteps had continued for approximately 3 minutes, circling the cabin at least twice before stopping near the front door. Collins had estimated the weight of whatever was outside at several £100 based on the heaviness of the footfalls and the sound they made on the wooden deck in front of the entrance. Shaw had slowly reached for her sidearm, a Glock 17 chambered in 9mm, while Collins had done the same with his service weapon. Both officers carried their weapons in quick-access holsters beside their bunks, a precaution that was standard procedure for remote assignments. They had also kept bear spray within easy reach, though Collins had privately questioned whether the aerosol canisters would be effective against a truly aggressive bear in the confined space of the cabin. The sounds from outside had stopped abruptly at 2:52 a.m., followed by complete silence that had been somehow more unsettling than the noise. Both officers had waited for nearly 10 minutes before Collins had carefully made his way to the front window, staying low and avoiding the direct line of sight from outside. The window was positioned to provide a view of the area immediately in front of the cabin, including the wooden deck and the beginning of the trail that led back toward the main road. Collins had peered through the steel mesh covering the window, but had been unable to see anything in the darkness outside. The solar-powered security light that normally illuminated the front of the cabin had apparently been damaged or disabled, leaving the area in complete darkness except for the faint glow from the emergency radio beacon on the antenna tower. "Can't see anything," Collins had whispered to Shaw. "Whatever it was, it's either gone or it's staying out of sight." Shaw had joined him at the window, bringing one of the cabin's powerful LED flashlights. "Should we call it in?" she had asked. Collins had considered the question for several moments before shaking his head. "Not yet. Could have been anything. Elk, maybe a moose. Let's wait and see if it comes back." They had maintained their vigil at the window for another 20 minutes before returning to their bunks, though neither officer had been able to fall back asleep. Shaw had lain in her bunk with her weapon within easy reach, listening to every sound from the forest around the cabin. The normal nighttime sounds of the wilderness, owls, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the trees, had seemed amplified and somehow threatening in the wake of the disturbance. Collins had been equally wakeful, running through mental checklists of emergency procedures and evacuation routes. The cabin's isolation, which had seemed like a peaceful retreat during daylight hours, now felt like a potential trap. The nearest backup was at least 30 minutes away by vehicle under the best conditions, and the rough mountain road would add significantly to response times, especially at night. At 3:15 a.m., Dr. Whitman had been awakened by what she later described as a sound like breaking glass, followed by what might have been shouting. The noise had been brief and distant, lasting only a few seconds before being swallowed by the night sounds of the forest. Dr. Whitman had considered investigating, but had decided that the darkness and uncertain terrain made such an expedition too dangerous for a woman of her age traveling alone. The attack had begun at 3:43 a.m., when something struck the front door of the cabin with tremendous force. Collins and Shaw had both been jolted awake by the impact, which had sounded like a battering ram hitting the reinforced wooden door. Before either officer could fully process what was happening, a second impact had followed, this one accompanied by a roar that Shaw would later tell investigators was like nothing I'd ever heard, not from any animal, not from any movie. It was pure rage and hunger combined. The front door of Station Charlie 7 had been designed to withstand significant abuse, but it had not been engineered to resist the determined assault of a grizzly bear weighing over 700 pounds. The third impact had splintered the doorframe, and the fourth had torn the door completely from its hinges, sending it crashing into the cabin's interior with a sound that could be heard for miles through the mountain air. Collins had reached for the radio, while Shaw had grabbed her weapon and flashlight, but before either could take effective action, the massive form of an adult male grizzly bear had filled the doorway. In the beam of Shaw's flashlight, the bear had appeared impossibly large, with a shoulder height that nearly touched the top of the doorframe and a massive head that seemed to take up the entire opening. The bear's fur had been dark brown, almost black in the artificial light, and its eyes had reflected the flashlight beam with an otherworldly green glow. "Radio!" Collins had shouted while drawing his sidearm, but his voice had been immediately drowned out by another roar from the bear as it had pushed through the destroyed doorway and into the cabin's interior. Shaw had opened fire immediately, her training taking over despite the surreal nature of the situation. Her first shot had struck the bear in the shoulder, producing a spray of blood but no apparent effect on the animal's behavior. The bear had turned toward her with a speed that defied its massive size, covering the distance between the doorway and her bunk in a single bound that had knocked over the communications table and sent equipment crashing to the floor. Collins had fired 3 rapid shots at the bear's center mass, each shot producing the distinctive pop of the 9mm rounds and the acrid smell of gunpowder in the confined space of the cabin. At least 2 of his shots had found their target, but the bear had seemed to ignore the impacts as it had focused its attention on Shaw, who had rolled from her bunk and was attempting to reach the cabin's back door. The bear had struck Shaw with its right front paw, a blow that had lifted her off her feet and sent her crashing into the wall beside the window. The impact had been audible even over the bear's continued roaring, the sound of bones breaking and air being forced from lungs. Shaw had dropped her weapon and flashlight, leaving Collins as the only source of resistance to the animal's attack. "Officer down! Officer down!" Collins had shouted into his radio while continuing to fire at the bear, though he was unclear whether his transmission had been received. The radio equipment had been damaged when the communications table was overturned, and static filled the channel. The bear had turned its attention to Collins after confirming that Shaw was no longer an immediate threat. Collins had backed toward the storage room while emptying his magazine into the animal's chest and head, but the 9mm rounds had seemed inadequate to stop a creature of such size and apparent determination. His final shot had struck the bear directly between the eyes, producing a spray of blood and a momentary pause in the attack, but the animal had shaken its massive head and continued its advance. Collins had attempted to reach the bear spray canister on the shelf beside the storage room door, but the bear had covered the remaining distance before he could deploy the aerosol weapon. The bear's jaws had closed around Collins's torso with a sound like breaking branches, lifting the officer from his feet and shaking him with the casual violence of a dog with a toy. Shaw had regained consciousness in time to witness the final moments of Collins's life, though her injuries had prevented her from offering any assistance. Her left arm had been broken in at least 2 places by the bear's initial strike, and several ribs had been cracked or broken by the impact with the wall. She had watched in helpless horror as the bear had continued its attack on Collins, whose screams had gradually faded to silence as his injuries overwhelmed his ability to remain conscious. At 3:47 a.m., Shaw had managed to reach the emergency radio with her uninjured right arm, keying the microphone just as the bear had released Collins' body and turned its attention back to her. Her transmission had been brief and interrupted, Charlie 7, bear attack, Collins down, need immediate. Before the bear had struck the radio equipment with enough force to destroy the remaining components and end all communication with the outside world. The bear had approached Shaw's position with what she later described as deliberate malice, moving slowly and maintaining eye contact as it closed the distance between them. Shaw had attempted to crawl toward the back door of the cabin, but her injuries had made movement nearly impossible. The bear had placed one massive front paw on her back, pinning her to the floor while it had investigated Collins's motionless form. Dr. Whitman had been awakened for the final time at 3:48 a.m. by the sound of gunshots echoing through the forest, followed by human screaming that had lasted for nearly a minute before abruptly stopping. The silence that had followed had been complete and absolute, broken only by the normal sounds of the wilderness night. Dr. Whitman had immediately attempted to contact Station Charlie 7 using her own emergency radio, but had received no response to repeated calls. The bear had remained in the cabin for approximately 40 minutes after the initial attack, during which time Shaw had drifted in and out of consciousness while listening to the sounds of the animal destroying the interior of the building. The bear had systematically torn apart the sleeping area, overturned furniture, and scattered supplies throughout the cabin. At one point, the animal had approached Shaw's position and had sniffed at her extensively, though it had not delivered a finishing attack. Shaw would later tell investigators that she had remained motionless during these final minutes of the bear's presence, convinced that any movement would provoke another attack. She had been unable to determine whether Collins was still alive, as his position behind the overturned communications table had been obscured from her view. The bear had eventually lost interest in the cabin's interior and had wandered outside, though Shaw had continued to hear it moving around the property for at least another hour. At 4:30 a.m., Dr. Whitman had made the decision to attempt a rescue mission, despite her age and the dangerous conditions. She had gathered her emergency medical supplies, a high-powered flashlight, and her own bear spray, before beginning the difficult hike through the forest towards Station Charlie 7. The trail between her cabin and the station was poorly maintained and treacherous in darkness, requiring nearly 2 hours of careful navigation. Dr. Whitman had reached the vicinity of Station Charlie 7 at approximately 6:15 a.m., just as the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the forest canopy. The scene that had greeted her was one of complete devastation. The front door of the cabin had been torn from its hinges and lay in pieces on the wooden deck. The door frame had been splintered and partially collapsed, and claw marks were visible on the exterior walls of the building. "Hello? Is anyone alive in there?" Dr. Whitman had called from a safe distance, unwilling to approach the damaged building without knowing the location of the bear that had caused the destruction. Shaw's weak response had been barely audible. "Help! Officer down! Bear's gone." Dr. Whitman had approached the cabin with extreme caution, constantly scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of the animal that had caused the attack. The interior of the cabin had been completely destroyed, with furniture overturned, supplies scattered, and blood covering most of the visible surfaces. Shaw had been lying near the back wall of the cabin, conscious but obviously severely injured. Collins had been found behind the overturned communications table, his injuries so severe that Dr. Whitman had immediately determined that he had not survived the attack. The veteran officer's body showed evidence of massive trauma consistent with a large predator attack, though Dr. Whitman had avoided examining the remains closely out of respect for the deceased and concern for Shaw's psychological state. Dr. Whitman had immediately begun providing first aid to Shaw while attempting to establish radio contact with emergency services using her portable radio. The mountainous terrain had made communication difficult, but she had eventually managed to reach the Fremont County Dispatch Center at 6:44 a.m., with a report of the attack and a request for immediate medical evacuation. "This is Dr. Eleanor Whitman calling from the vicinity of Station Charlie 7, she had transmitted. "We have a confirmed bear attack with one officer deceased and one critically injured. Request immediate helicopter evacuation and law enforcement response. The attacking animal is still at large in the area." The dispatch center had immediately initiated emergency protocols, contacting the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and emergency medical services. The remote location of the station had complicated the rescue response, as helicopter evacuation would be required due to Shaw's injuries and the rough terrain that would make ground transportation extremely difficult. Shaw had remained conscious during Dr. Whitman's initial treatment, providing crucial information about the attack while medical personnel were en route. "It was huge," Shaw had whispered, her voice barely audible due to her injuries. "Bigger than anything I've ever seen. It came through the front door like it was paper. Collins fought. He emptied his magazine into it and didn't even slow it down. Doctor." Whitman had documented Shaw's injuries as best she could, given the limited medical supplies available. The officer had suffered a compound fracture of her left forearm, multiple rib fractures, possible internal injuries, and severe lacerations on her back and shoulders from the bear's claws. Shaw had also shown signs of shock and hypothermia from lying on the cabin floor for several hours in the cold mountain air. The first rescue helicopter had arrived at Station Charlie 7 at 8:23 a.m., a Wyoming Air National Guard medical evacuation unit that had been dispatched from the airfield near Casper. The helicopter crew had included 2 flight medics with extensive trauma experience, but even they had been visibly affected by the scene inside the destroyed cabin. Shaw had been stabilized and prepared for transport within 15 minutes. Though the crew had advised Dr. Whitman that the officer's condition was critical and that survival was uncertain. Collins's body had been left at the scene pending the arrival of the coroner and the investigation team, a decision that had been difficult but necessary given the priority of evacuating Shaw and the limited capacity of the medical helicopter. Dr. Whitman had agreed to remain at the station until the investigation team arrived, despite the continued presence of the bear in the area. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department had dispatched a team of wildlife specialists to track and locate the bear responsible for the attack, a process that had begun even before Shaw's evacuation was complete. The team had included veteran bear management specialist Thomas "Tom" Richardson, a 30-year employee of the department who had extensive experience with problem bear situations. Richardson had examined the scene at Station Charlie 7 with the methodical approach of someone who had investigated dozens of bear encounters over his career. The physical evidence had clearly indicated an adult male grizzly bear of exceptional size, with claw marks on the cabin walls measuring higher than Richardson could reach with his outstretched arm. Tracks around the building had confirmed the bear's size, with front paw prints measuring over 11 inches in length. "This is one of the largest bears I've tracked in Wyoming," Richardson had told his team while documenting the evidence around the cabin. "Based on the size of these tracks and the height of the claw marks, I'd estimate this animal at 700 pounds minimum, possibly closer to 800. The bear's behavior had also been unusual, according to Richardson's analysis. Most grizzly bear attacks on humans were defensive in nature, occurring when bears were surprised or felt threatened. The attack at Station Charlie 7 had shown none of the characteristics of a defensive encounter. Instead, the evidence suggested a predatory attack by an animal that had deliberately sought out human prey. "The bear didn't just wander into this situation," Richardson had explained to the investigation team. "It approached the cabin multiple times over several hours, testing the defenses, learning the routine. This was planned behavior, which is extremely rare but extremely dangerous. The tracking team had located the bear's trail leading away from Station Charlie 7 at approximately 10:30 a.m., following a clear path of disturbed vegetation and occasional tracks through the forest. The trail had led northwest into increasingly dense timber, toward an area of steep terrain that would make tracking difficult and dangerous for the pursuing team. Richardson had made the decision to call in additional resources rather than pursue the bear immediately with his small team. "This animal has already killed one person and nearly killed another," he had radioed to his supervisor. "It's shown no fear of humans, and it's probably the largest bear any of us have ever encountered. We need more people and better equipment before we go into its territory." The expanded tracking team had assembled at Station Charlie 7 by 2 p.m., including additional wildlife specialists, law enforcement officers, and a professional hunting guide with experience in dangerous game. The team had been armed with high-powered rifles chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum and .375H and H Magnum, calibers considered appropriate for large and potentially aggressive bears. Shaw had been transported to the Regional Medical Center in Casper, where a trauma team had been standing by to treat her injuries. The medical staff had been briefed on the nature of her injuries during the helicopter flight, but the extent of the damage had still been shocking to experienced trauma physicians. Shaw had required immediate surgery to repair her fractured arm, internal injuries, and the extensive tissue damage caused by the bear's claws. Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief trauma surgeon who had led Shaw's treatment, had later described her injuries as among the most severe he had encountered in 25 years of emergency medicine. Officer Shaw was extraordinarily fortunate to survive this encounter, Dr. Webb had told reporters. The injuries were consistent with an attack by a very large and powerful animal. Without Dr. Whitman's immediate first aid and the rapid response of our medical evacuation team, the outcome would almost certainly have been fatal. Shaw had remained in critical condition for the first 48 hours following the attack, during which time she had undergone 3 separate surgeries to address her various injuries. The psychological trauma had been as significant as the physical damage, with Shaw experiencing nightmares and panic attacks whenever she was left alone, even in the secure environment of the hospital. The bear tracking operation had continued throughout the afternoon of August 3rd, with the expanded team following the animal's trail deeper into the wilderness. The terrain had become increasingly difficult as the day progressed, with steep slopes and dense underbrush that provided numerous opportunities for the bear to ambush any pursuing humans. The team had been forced to proceed with extreme caution, constantly scanning for signs of the animal's presence. At 4:17 p.m., the tracking team had discovered evidence that the bear had fed recently, though not on human remains. A partially consumed elk carcass had been found approximately 3 miles from Station Charlie 7, hidden beneath a pile of branches and debris in the typical manner of a bear caching its kill. The carcass had been fresh, with evidence that the bear had returned to feed multiple times over the preceding few days. Richardson had studied the cached elk with growing concern. "This changes everything," he had told his team. "This bear wasn't starving or desperate when it attacked the station. It had a ready food source, which means the attack was purely predatory. This animal is actively hunting humans." The discovery had prompted a change in strategy for the tracking operation. Rather than continuing to follow the bear's trail through difficult terrain where the animal held every advantage, the team had decided to establish observation posts around the elk carcass and wait for the bear to return to feed. The strategy carried its own risks, as the team would be operating in the bear's territory during hours when grizzly bears were most active, but it offered the best chance of locating and eliminating the animal. News of the bear attack had reached the media by late afternoon on August 3rd, initially through emergency radio communications that had been monitored by amateur radio operators in the area. The first news reports had been brief and lacking in detail, but by evening, television news crews from Denver and Salt Lake City had begun arriving in Dubois to cover the story. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department had held a press conference at 7 p.m. on August 3rd, with Department Director Janet Morrison providing official details about the attack and the ongoing response. Morrison had been careful to balance public safety concerns with the need to avoid panic among residents and visitors to the area. "We are dealing with an extremely unusual situation involving a large adult grizzly bear that has demonstrated aggressive behavior toward humans," Morrison had told reporters. "Our wildlife management team is actively working to locate and address this animal, and we are taking all necessary precautions to ensure public safety." When asked about the circumstances of the attack, Morrison had declined to provide specific details out of respect for the victims and their families. She had confirmed that one law enforcement officer had been killed and another seriously injured, and that the injured officer was receiving medical treatment at a regional trauma center. The press conference had generated additional media attention, with national news networks picking up the story by the following morning. The combination of law enforcement officers being killed by a wild animal and the remote wilderness setting had created significant public interest in the story. Collins's family had been notified of his death by Fremont County Sheriff David Martinez, who had driven to their home in Riverton personally to deliver the news rather than making the notification by telephone. Collins's wife, Sarah, had been preparing breakfast for their two teenage children when Sheriff Martinez had arrived at their front door at 6:30 a.m. on August 3rd. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about Robert," Sheriff Martinez had said, his voice heavy with the burden of delivering tragic news to a fellow law enforcement family. Sarah Collins had immediately understood that something terrible had happened, though the specific details had been beyond her worst fears. Collins's death had been particularly difficult for the law enforcement community in Fremont County, where officers often worked alone over vast territories and depended on each other for backup and support. Collins had been well respected among his colleagues, known for his willingness to take on difficult assignments and his mentoring of newer officers like Shaw. Shaw's family had been notified of her injuries while she was still in surgery, with her parents driving through the night from their home in Nebraska to reach the hospital in Casper. Shaw's mother, Linda, had later told reporters that the phone call from the hospital had been every parent's worst nightmare, being told that your child has been mauled by a wild animal and might not survive. The bear tracking operation had resumed at first light on August 4th, with the team establishing concealed observation posts around the cached elk carcass. The overnight hours had been tense but uneventful, with no sign of the bear returning to its kill site. Wildlife specialists had begun to worry that the animal had abandoned the carcass and moved to a different territory, which would greatly complicate efforts to locate and capture or destroy it. At 8:45 a.m. on August 4th, motion-activated trail cameras placed around the carcass had captured images of the bear returning to feed. The photographs had confirmed Richardson's estimates of the animal's exceptional size, showing a massive grizzly bear with a distinctive scar across its muzzle and a notched right ear that would help with identification. The images had also revealed that the bear appeared to be uninjured, despite being shot multiple times during the attack at Station Charlie 7. "These pictures confirm what we suspected," Richardson had radioed to his command post. "This is an exceptionally large and apparently healthy adult male. The fact that it's showing no effects from being shot multiple times suggests either incredibly tough hide or poor shot placement under stress conditions." The team had moved into position around the carcass site at 9:30 a.m., with sharpshooters positioned at multiple angles to ensure that the bear could be engaged regardless of which direction it approached from. The waiting had been nerve-wracking, as team members were aware that they were operating in the territory of an animal that had already demonstrated its willingness and ability to kill humans. The bear had appeared at the carcass site at 11:17 a.m., approaching from the north through dense timber with the silent movement that belied its massive size. Richardson, observing through binoculars from a position approximately 100 yards away, had been struck by the animal's apparent confidence and lack of concern about potential threats. "Target acquired," the lead sharpshooter had whispered into his radio. "Large adult male grizzly. Matches description from trail camera images. Clear shot available." "Take the shot," Richardson had responded immediately, knowing that hesitation could allow the bear to disappear back into the timber. The first rifle shot had been fired at 11:18 a.m., a .375H and H Magnum round that had struck the bear in the chest cavity from a distance of 85 yards. The impact had been immediately visible, with the bear stumbling and roaring in pain and rage. However, the animal had not been immediately incapacitated, instead charging in the direction of the shot with the speed and determination that made grizzly bears so dangerous when wounded. A second shooter had engaged the bear from a different angle, firing two rapid shots that had both struck the animal in the shoulder and ribcage area. The bear had changed direction toward this new threat, covering ground with frightening speed despite its injuries. A third shooter had fired the killing shot from a position directly ahead of the bear's charge, a .300 Winchester Magnum round that had struck the animal in the head and finally stopped its advance. The bear had died at 11:20 a.m. on August 4th, less than 36 hours after the attack at Station Charlie 7. Richardson and his team had approached the carcass with extreme caution, even after confirming that the animal was dead. The size of the bear had been even more impressive up close, with Richardson's measurements confirming a total length of 8 feet 4 inches and an estimated weight of over 750 pounds. "This is the largest grizzly bear I've encountered in my entire career," Richardson had told his supervisor by radio while documenting the animal. "It's also one of the oldest, based on tooth wear and general condition. My estimate is that this bear was at least 20 years old, possibly older." Examination of the bear's body had revealed evidence of the gunshots fired by Collins and Shaw during the attack at Station Charlie 7. 4 9mm bullets had been recovered from the animal's chest and shoulder area, though none had penetrated deeply enough to cause immediate incapacitation or death. The bear's thick hide, heavy muscle mass, and adrenaline response had allowed it to continue its attack despite being wounded. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a wildlife veterinarian with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, had conducted a preliminary necropsy on the bear at the kill site. Her examination had revealed that the animal had been in excellent physical condition prior to the tracking operation, with no signs of disease, injury, or malnutrition that might have explained its aggressive behavior toward humans. "This bear was a prime specimen," Dr. Hayes had reported, "well-fed, healthy, and in its physical prime, despite its advanced age. There's nothing in its condition that would explain why it targeted humans as prey, which makes this case extremely unusual from a wildlife management perspective." Tissue samples from the bear had been collected for DNA analysis and disease testing, part of a comprehensive investigation into the factors that might have contributed to the predatory behavior. The results of these tests would not be available for several weeks, but they would be crucial for understanding whether the bear's behavior represented an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. Shaw had begun to show signs of improvement by August 5th, with doctors cautiously optimistic about her physical recovery. The psychological trauma remained severe, however, with Shaw experiencing flashbacks and anxiety attacks that required ongoing treatment by mental health professionals experienced in treating post-traumatic stress disorder. The physical injuries will heal with time and proper medical care, Dr. Webb had explained to Shaw's family. The psychological recovery is much more complex and will likely require months or years of specialized treatment. Officer Shaw witnessed events that no one should ever have to experience. Shaw's first coherent conversation with investigators had taken place on August 6th, nearly 3 days after the attack. Detective Lieutenant Karen Foster of the Wyoming State Police had conducted the interview with extreme sensitivity, understanding that Shaw's testimony would be crucial for the official investigation, but that pushing too hard could interfere with her recovery. "I know this is difficult," Detective Foster had said as she began the recorded interview, "but I need you to tell me everything you remember about the attack, no matter how small the detail might seem." Shaw's account had been comprehensive despite the trauma she had experienced, providing investigators with a minute-by-minute timeline of the events at Station Charlie 7. Her description of the bear's behavior had been particularly valuable, as it confirmed that the attack had been predatory rather than defensive in nature. "It didn't act like any animal I've ever seen," Shaw had told Detective Foster. "It was patient, deliberate. It circled the cabin, tested our defenses, waited for the right moment. When it finally attacked, it was like it had planned every move. This wasn't a scared animal defending itself. This was a predator that had decided we were prey." The official investigation had been completed by August 15th, with a comprehensive report documenting the circumstances of the attack and the response by law enforcement and wildlife management agencies. The report had concluded that Collins and Shaw had followed proper procedures throughout their assignment and that the attack represented an extremely rare but unpredictable wildlife encounter. Collins's funeral had been held on August 12th at the First Presbyterian Church in Riverton, with law enforcement officers from throughout Wyoming attending to honor their fallen colleague. Sheriff Martinez had delivered the eulogy, describing Collins as a dedicated officer who had given his life in service to his community. Robert Collins understood the risks that come with protecting the public in one of the most remote and challenging environments in America, Sheriff Martinez had said. He faced those risks willingly because he believed in the importance of the work we do. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. Shaw had been released from the hospital on August 20th, though her recovery was far from complete. She had required additional surgery on her left arm and would need months of physical therapy to regain full use of the limb. The psychological impact of the attack continued to affect every aspect of her daily life, from sleeping to being alone in any enclosed space. Dr. Patricia Coleman, a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, had begun working with Shaw immediately after her release from the hospital. Dr. Coleman had extensive experience treating first responders who had experienced traumatic events, but she acknowledged that Shaw's case presented unique challenges. Officer Shaw survived an encounter that claimed the life of her partner and very nearly killed her as well, Dr. Coleman had explained. She's dealing with survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the physical limitations imposed by her injuries. Recovery will be a long process that will require tremendous strength and support from her family and colleagues. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department had implemented new safety protocols for remote station assignments in response to the attack at Station Charlie 7. These protocols included mandatory buddy system assignments, enhanced communication equipment, and improved bear-resistant modifications to all remote facilities. Dr. Whitman had been recognized for her heroic actions in rescuing Shaw, receiving commendations from both the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and the Fremont County Sheriff's Department. At age 73, she had risked her own life to hike through dangerous terrain in darkness to provide aid to the injured officer. Dr. Whitman's quick thinking and courageous actions undoubtedly saved Officer Shaw's life, Sheriff Martinez had said during the commendation ceremony. Her willingness to put herself at risk to help others exemplifies the finest traditions of public service. The attack at Station Charlie 7 had generated ongoing discussion among wildlife management professionals about the factors that might cause a grizzly bear to engage in predatory behavior toward humans. While such attacks were extremely rare, the incident highlighted the need for continued research into bear behavior and the development of more effective deterrent technologies. Dr. Hayes had published a preliminary report on the bear necropsy in the Journal of Wildlife Management, contributing to the scientific understanding of unusual predatory behavior in large carnivores. Her research had confirmed that the bear showed no signs of disease or injury that might have altered its normal behavior patterns. This case represents a statistical anomaly that may never be fully explained, Dr. Hayes had written. The bear was healthy, well-fed, and had no apparent reason to target humans as prey. Such incidents serve as reminders that we are dealing with powerful wild animals whose behavior can be unpredictable under certain circumstances. Shaw had attempted to return to limited duty with the Fremont County Sheriff's Department in November 2024. But had been unable to cope with the stress and isolation of patrol work. Her experience at Station Charlie 7 had fundamentally changed her relationship with the wilderness areas she had once loved, replacing her sense of peace and connection with nature with anxiety and hypervigilance. "I used to find the mountains peaceful and restorative," Shaw had told Dr. Coleman during one of their sessions. "Now, every shadow could be hiding a threat. Every sound could be something dangerous. I've lost something that was central to who I was, and I don't know if I'll ever get it back." Collins's family had established a memorial scholarship fund in his honor, providing financial assistance to children of law enforcement officers pursuing higher education. The scholarship had been funded through donations from law enforcement agencies throughout the region, as well as private contributions from citizens who had been touched by Collins's story. Sarah Collins had spoken publicly about her husband's death for the first time at the scholarship fund announcement, describing the man behind the badge who had loved his family and his work with equal devotion. "Robert knew that police work in rural Wyoming carried certain risks," Sarah Collins had said. "He accepted those risks because he believed in protecting the people and places he cared about. This scholarship is a way to honor his memory by helping other young people achieve their dreams." The remote station Charlie 7 had been rebuilt with enhanced security features, including reinforced doors and windows, improved communications equipment, and a more comprehensive early warning system. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department had also installed motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of the station to provide advance notice of large animal activity in the area. However, the psychological impact of the August 3rd attack had made it difficult to find personnel willing to accept assignments at the rebuilt facility. The station's association with the traumatic events had created a persistent reluctance among officers to work alone in such isolated conditions, leading to discussions about whether remote outposts remained viable in an era of improved mobile communications and transportation. The investigation into the bear attack had officially closed on December 15, 2024, with no additional information coming to light about the factors that had motivated the animal's predatory behavior. The case had been classified as an unpredictable wildlife encounter that, while extremely rare, highlighted the inherent risks of working in bear habitat. Shaw had made the difficult decision to leave law enforcement entirely in January 2025, accepting a medical retirement due to the ongoing effects of her physical and psychological injuries. Her departure had been a significant loss for the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, which had invested considerable resources in her training and had hoped she would eventually return to full duty. Officer Shaw was an outstanding law enforcement professional who was victimized by circumstances beyond anyone's control, Sheriff Martinez had said upon announcing her retirement. While we're disappointed to lose her service, we understand and support her decision to prioritize her health and recovery. The events of August 3, 2024, had fundamentally changed the approach to wildlife management and law enforcement operations in remote areas of Wyoming. The attack at Station Charlie 7 had demonstrated that even experienced professionals following proper safety protocols could become victims of unpredictable animal behavior. Training programs for law enforcement and wildlife management personnel had been updated to include more extensive instruction in bear behavior, enhanced firearms training with appropriate calibers for large predators, and improved protocols for emergency communication from remote locations. These changes had been implemented throughout Wyoming and had been adopted by other western states with similar wildlife management challenges. Dr. Whitman had continued her research work despite the traumatic events she had witnessed, though she had acknowledged that her perspective on bear behavior had been permanently altered by the experience. Her ongoing studies had focused on identifying behavioral indicators that might predict when individual bears were more likely to engage in aggressive interactions with humans. The attack at Station Charlie 7 taught us that our understanding of bear behavior is still incomplete, Dr. Whitman had written in her research summary. While we can identify general patterns and risk factors, we must always remember that we are dealing with individual animals whose behavior can deviate from expected norms in ways that can be dangerous or even fatal. The legacy of Officer Robert Collins and the survival of Officer Megan Shaw had become part of the institutional memory of law enforcement in Wyoming, serving as both a tribute to those who serve in dangerous conditions and a reminder of the risks inherent in protecting the public in one of America's most challenging environments. The events of that August night had demonstrated both the fragility of human life when confronted by nature's most powerful predators and the courage of individuals who choose to work in defense of their communities despite those risks.